What if humanity's history wasn't shaped by humans alone, but by a war far beyond Earth? Some theories claim that a massive galactic conflict once took place between two powerful alien races, the advanced Arcturians and the mysterious, often feared Draconians. According to these ideas, this wasn't just a distant space war. It may have directly influenced life on Earth, human evolution, and the course of our history. Ancient myths, modern UFO theories, and hidden narratives all seem to point toward one question. Did a secret alien war shape the world we live in today? Or is this one of the most elaborate cosmic myths ever created? In this video, we explore the mystery behind the Arcturians versus Draconians and the theory of a galactic war that may have changed everything. There is a war that human beings have been fighting for longer than they have been human. It is not a war recorded in any history book approved by any government. It is not a war that was settled at any table, signed away in any treaty, or commemorated with any monument that still stands on this earth. It is a war so vast in its scope, so ancient in its origins, and so deeply woven into the fabric of what we call civilization that most people who have felt its effects have never once understood what they were feeling. They called it fate. They called it God's will. They called it the rise and fall of empires, the collision of cultures, the inexplicable violence that seems to live inside the human heart like a wound that never fully closes. But it was never any of those things. It was a war, a real war, and it did not begin on this planet. To understand what has happened to humanity, you have to be willing to go somewhere most people are not prepared to go. You have to be willing to look at the night sky not as a ceiling of light-scattered comfort, but as a battlefield. You have to be willing to consider that the universe is not empty, that it has never been empty, and that the civilizations moving through it have agendas that make the political dramas of human history look like arguments between children in a sandbox. You have to consider that the Earth, this small, rocky world orbiting an unremarkable star at the edge of one of hundreds of billions of galaxies, was chosen, targeted, fought over, and that the beings who chose it, targeted it, and fought over it were not metaphors, not archetypes pulled from the collective unconscious, not demons and angels invented to explain suffering. They were real, they came from real places, and some of them are still here. The two civilizations at the center of this story are known in the body of literature, testimony, and transmission that has accumulated across the last century by names drawn from the star systems from which they originate. The first are the Arcturians, beings associated with the star Arcturus, the brightest star in the northern celestial hemisphere, located approximately 36 light-years from Earth in the constellation Bodas. The second are the Draconians, a reptilian civilization associated with the Draco constellation, a vast, sprawling formation of stars that winds across the northern sky like a serpent frozen in the act of turning. These two names carry enormous weight in the literature of what is variously called exopolitics, extraterrestrial contact research, and ancient cosmology. They appear again and again across cultures, across centuries, in sources that had no access to one another, in traditions that developed on opposite sides of the planet, in the testimony of individuals who had no reason to invent what they reported. The consistency of the picture that emerges when you lay all of this testimony side by side is not something that can be easily dismissed by anyone willing to look at it honestly. This is not a documentary about belief. It is not asking you to accept anything on faith. What it is doing is taking seriously a body of evidence that has been systematically marginalized, ridiculed, and suppressed, and presenting it in the form that it deserves, which is the form of serious historical and cosmological inquiry. The question this documentary is asking is not whether you believe in aliens. The question is whether the story of humanity that you have been given is the complete story, and whether the war that appears to have been fought over this planet, over the bodies, minds, and souls of human beings, is a war that is still ongoing, and whether, if that war is still ongoing, you have any say in how it ends. To answer those questions, we have to begin at the beginning, not the beginning of human recorded history, not the beginning of the Bronze Age or the Neolithic period, or even the first appearance of anatomically modern humans in the fossil record. We have to go back much further than that. We have to go back to the structure of the galaxy itself, to the way intelligent life develops and organizes itself across the span of deep time, to the political and spiritual architecture of a universe that has been evolving conscious beings for far longer than the Earth has existed as a solid object. The Milky Way galaxy is approximately 13.5 billion years old. The Earth is 4.5 billion years old. That 9 billion year gap is not nothing. It is an almost incomprehensible stretch of time during which stars formed, burned, exploded, seeded space with complex elements, and allowed new stars and new planets to form from those elements. It is a stretch of time during which, if life follows the same general principles it appears to follow here, thousands or millions of intelligent civilizations could have emerged, developed, collapsed, and either died or evolved into something beyond what we would currently recognize as civilization. The idea that in all of that time, across all of those billions of years, with all of those possibilities, the only technological intelligence in the galaxy is the one that appeared on Earth roughly 12,000 years ago in the form of organized agriculture and the first city-states is not a serious scientific position. It is a kind of species narcissism so profound that it functions almost as a defense mechanism. If we are alone, we cannot be in danger from what we cannot see. If we are alone, the universe is ours by default. If we are alone, the history of this planet is the only history that matters. All of those comforts vanish the moment you take seriously the possibility that we are not alone and never have been. The civilizations we are discussing in this documentary did not come into existence recently. They are not civilizations in the sense that Rome or the Han Dynasty or the Aztec Empire was a civilization, bounded by centuries and geographic limitations. The civilizations involved in the conflict that shaped this planet are measured in millions of years. They developed during periods when our own sun was still a gas cloud, slowly gravitating toward collapse. They passed through phases of development that would be utterly alien to human categories of understanding, phases in which the distinction between physical and non-physical existence blurred and sometimes dissolved entirely, phases in which the manipulation of matter, energy, space, and time became as routine as the manipulation of stone tools was for early hominids. By the time these civilizations turned their attention to the region of space that contains our solar system, they had already been navigating the galaxy for longer than the Earth had been a planet. The Arcturian civilization is described across a remarkable range of sources, from the channeled communications of the mid-20th century to the testimony of individuals who claim direct contact experience, from the cosmological traditions of specific indigenous cultures to the material that has emerged through regression hypnosis and related methods. What emerges from these sources is a consistent picture of a civilization that has reached what many researchers describe as fifth-dimensional consciousness, a state of being in which individual identity remains coherent but is no longer separated from collective awareness in the way human consciousness is separated. The Arcturians are described as beings who have transcended the biological imperatives that govern lower-dimensional existence, the drives toward territory, reproduction, resource acquisition, and dominance that characterize life forms still embedded in what we call third-dimensional physical reality. They are described as healers, teachers, and guardians, beings whose primary orientation is toward the support and elevation of developing civilizations, beings who understand the arc of conscious evolution across galactic time, and who have committed themselves to ensuring that arc continues to move toward greater complexity, greater integration, and greater light. That word, light, is not metaphor in this context, or rather, it is both literal and metaphorical simultaneously, in a way that makes the distinction between those categories less meaningful than we typically assume. The Arcturians are consistently described as beings whose physical form, to whatever extent they still maintain physical form, is associated with intense luminosity, with frequencies of light and sound that operate at levels beyond normal human perception, with colors that human visual systems cannot register. They are described as tall, often appearing to human percipients as elongated and graceful, with large eyes that convey a quality of compassion and intelligence that witnesses struggle to articulate in ordinary language. They are not beings who operate primarily through physical force. Their power, such as it is, derives from what might be called energetic influence, the ability to affect the vibrational state of other beings, other places, and other situations through focused intention and what can only be described as love, operating not as an emotion but as a fundamental force. The Draconian civilization presents an almost perfectly inverted picture. This is not a coincidence, and understanding why it is not a coincidence is essential to understanding the nature of the conflict. The Draconians are described across an equally extensive body of source material as a civilization that has developed along a fundamentally different axis than the Arcturians, where the Arcturian trajectory is toward integration, dissolution of separation, and service to the broader community of consciousness. The Draconian trajectory has been, for millions of years, toward hierarchy, domination, and the consolidation of power. The Draconians are reptilian in form, and that form is important not merely as a biological fact, but as a window into their psychology and their value system. Because in their case, the biological and the philosophical have evolved in close relationship with each other. Reptilian biology, as we understand it from Earth-based life forms, is characterized by certain consistent features. Cold-bloodedness, meaning dependence on external heat sources rather than internally generated warmth. A nervous system organized around survival, threat detection, and territorial behavior. Reproductive strategies that generally involve large numbers of offspring and relatively little parental investment per individual. A social structure built around dominance hierarchies, where the strongest individual commands the group and lesser individuals compete for position. These are not moral failures in Earth reptiles. They are adaptive strategies that have allowed reptilian life forms to persist for hundreds of millions of years on this planet. But in a civilization that has had millions of years to develop those biological tendencies into philosophical frameworks, social institutions, political systems, and military strategies, they produce something qualitatively different from anything we see in terrestrial reptiles. They produce a civilization organized at the deepest level around the principle that the universe is a competition for resources, that consciousness is a commodity, that other beings exist either as threats to be neutralized or as assets to be exploited, and that the highest expression of civilization is the ability to dominate the maximum number of other civilizations while expending the minimum amount of effort. This worldview is not presented here as evil in a cartoonish sense. It is presented as a coherent philosophical position that emerges naturally from a particular biological and evolutionary history, a position that has internal logic, that has produced genuinely sophisticated intellectual and technological achievements, and that represents one of the fundamental poles of a tension that may run through the entire galaxy. The tension between service to self and service to others, between the drive to accumulate and dominate and the drive to share and elevate, between the philosophy that sees other beings as objects and the philosophy that sees other beings as aspects of a shared consciousness that includes the self. This tension is not unique to the relationship between Arcturians and Draconians. It is the central moral and philosophical tension of conscious life everywhere it has emerged. But in the conflict between these two specific civilizations, that tension reached an expression of such scale and intensity that its effects are still being felt in every aspect of human life today. Before we can understand how the conflict developed, we need to understand the galactic context in which it occurred. The universe is not an unorganized collection of civilizations moving independently through space. Over the billions of years that intelligent life has existed in this galaxy, various forms of organization have emerged at civilizational scales far beyond anything human political science has terms for. These include what different sources describe using various names: galactic federations, confederacies of planets, intergalactic councils, alliances of worlds, The names differ across the traditions and testimonies that reference them, but the general structure is consistent. There are organized communities of civilizations that have agreed, to varying degrees, on certain principles governing the interaction between intelligent species. There are rules of engagement, protocols around the contact with and intervention in the development of younger civilizations, standards regarding the use of certain weapons and technologies, and mechanisms for resolving disputes that do not involve the total annihilation of the parties involved. The most widely referenced of these organizational structures across the contact literature and the channeled material is known by various names, most commonly the Galactic Federation of Light, or simply the Galactic Federation. This is described as a collective of civilizations committed to the principles of peace, cooperation, and the protection of developing worlds. The Arcturians are described as one of its founding members, as one of its most respected and influential voices, and as among its most active participants in the work of supporting civilizations like ours through the difficult transitions of early development. The Draconians, by contrast, are described as existing outside this federation, or in persistent conflict with it, as a civilization that either refused to join on the grounds that its philosophical commitments were incompatible with the Federation's principles, or that was excluded because its behavior patterns constituted too great a threat to the civilizations the Federation was committed to protecting. This tension between these two poles of galactic civilization, the Federation model and the Draconian Empire model, forms the large-scale backdrop against which the specific conflict over Earth must be understood. Earth did not just happen to become a battleground by accident. It became a battleground because it occupies a particular position, geographically, dimensionally, and spiritually, that made it strategically important to both sides of this fundamental galactic divide. Understanding why the Earth matters, why this small, young, biologically rich world became the focus of a conflict between some of the oldest and most powerful civilizations in the galaxy, requires understanding the nature of what the Earth actually is and what the human beings living on it actually are. The Earth is not ordinary. The scientific consensus tends to treat it as a remarkably habitable but otherwise unremarkable planet, one of potentially billions of similar worlds in the galaxy. But the perspective that emerges from the sources we are examining treats the Earth as something far more specific and far more significant. The Earth is described as a uniquely biodiverse world, a planet whose combination of conditions produced a density and variety of living species that is genuinely rare, even by galactic standards. It is described as a planet that sits at a specific intersection of energetic lines within the galaxy, a kind of node point in the larger grid of consciousness that connects the living network of the cosmos. And it is described as a world that has been seeded deliberately and multiple times with biological material that contains genetic potential of extraordinary richness. Genetic potential that both the Arcturian and Draconian civilizations recognized from a very early point in Earth's history, and that both civilizations had very different ideas about what to do with. The human being is not an accident of evolution. This is one of the most consistently repeated claims across the entire body of source material we are drawing from, and it is one that, when examined alongside the actual evidence from paleoanthropology and genetics, is significantly harder to dismiss than the mainstream scientific establishment has generally acknowledged. The human genome contains what scientists themselves have characterized as anomalies, sequences, and structures whose origin and function are not fully understood within the standard evolutionary model. The speed of human cognitive development, the emergence of language, abstract reasoning, symbolic thought, and cultural complexity in what is, in evolutionary terms, an extremely short period, has produced genuine puzzlement in the scientific community. The gap between human cognitive capacity and the cognitive capacity of our closest biological relatives is far wider than the gap that typically separates related species. And explaining that gap purely through the conventional mechanisms of natural selection has proven more difficult than initial confidence suggested. What the contact literature and the cosmological traditions suggest, with remarkable consistency, is that the human species is the result of intervention, that the biological raw material provided by the Earth's evolutionary process was worked with, modified, enhanced, and in some cases fundamentally restructured by beings from beyond this planet. That the human genome is not purely a product of terrestrial evolution, but is instead a composite, containing genetic material from multiple extraterrestrial sources that was introduced into the Earth's biosphere at specific points in the deep past, and that the conflict between the Arcturians and the Draconians is, at one of its most fundamental levels, a conflict about that genome, about what it contains, what it is capable of becoming, and who gets to determine how that potential develops. This is the starting point, a universe billions of years old. Two civilizations of incomprehensible antiquity and power, organized around philosophically opposed principles. A small, biologically extraordinary planet sitting at a node point in the galactic grid of consciousness, and a human species whose genetic heritage connects it to both of those civilizations and to the conflict between them in ways that its members are only now beginning to remember. From this starting point, everything else follows. The ancient wars that scorched continents and sank cities beneath the sea, the manipulation of human religion, government, and culture by non-human intelligences pursuing agendas of their own, the suppression of human potential, the careful management of human consciousness, the repeated interventions, both helpful and predatory, that human beings have experienced and recorded throughout their history, while mostly lacking the framework to understand what they were actually experiencing. All of it follows from this starting point, and all of it connects to a conflict that is not over, that is in fact reaching something like a climax in this very era, in the years and decades unfolding right now, as the human species approaches a threshold that both sides of this ancient war have been preparing for since before recorded history began. The next part of this story takes us deep into the specifics of who the Arcturians actually are, not what they look like, though that matters, not where they come from, though that matters too, but who they are in the sense that matters most, which is what they want, what they believe, what they have been doing in relationship to this planet, and why, after millions of years of development, beings of their sophistication and power would concern themselves with the fate of a young, struggling species on a small planet in a quiet corner of the galaxy. The answer to that question is more complex and more beautiful and more disturbing than most people are prepared for. The star Arcturus is approximately 113 times larger than our Sun and burns approximately 170 times as bright. It is an orange giant in the late stages of its stellar life, and it has been burning for approximately 7 billion years longer than our own Sun. In human terms, it is ancient beyond comprehension, and the civilization that developed in its system reflects that antiquity in every aspect of its being. The Arcturians did not always exist in the form they are now described as occupying. Like all long-lived civilizations, they passed through stages of development, periods of conflict and resolution, periods of crisis and transformation, periods in which their survival was far from guaranteed and their trajectory far from certain. There were Arcturians who chose paths of domination, who experimented with the same logic that drove Draconian civilization, who learned through consequences rather than wisdom that the service-to-self path, pursued to its logical conclusion, produces outcomes that are satisfying to no one, not even those who appear to have won. The turning point in Arcturian civilization, the moment that their sources describe as the Great Choosing, the moment when their civilization collectively and deliberately oriented itself towards service to others as its organizing principle, is described as having occurred so long ago that its exact timing is lost even to them. What is preserved is the understanding that this choosing was not easy, that it involved a conflict within their own civilization, that it required the resolution of the same tension that runs through all conscious life, and that its resolution produced the civilization that now exists, the civilization that turned its attention to the developing worlds of the galaxy with the intention not of colonizing or exploiting them, but of protecting and guiding them through the same dangerous passages that the Arcturians themselves once navigated. The Arcturians described their relationship to Earth and to humanity in terms that human beings most frequently reach for religious language to express. They call it a family relationship. They speak of humanity as younger siblings, as children in the cosmic sense, not as subordinates or as subjects, but as beings with whom they share a genuine bond of kinship, beings whose success and flourishing they have a personal stake in that is not reducible to strategy or self-interest. They speak of agreements made at levels of reality beyond the physical, agreements between their civilization and the soul community of humanity, agreements about guidance, protection, and the long, slow work of helping a species that was born into extraordinarily difficult circumstances find its way toward the potential encoded in its own DNA. And this brings us to the heart of why the Arcturians and the Draconians are in conflict over this planet. Because the Draconians also recognize what is in that DNA. They recognized it long before the Arcturians did, in some accounts. And what they want to do with it is the precise opposite of what the Arcturians intend. The Arcturian civilization, architects of light. There is a particular kind of difficulty that comes with trying to describe a civilization whose development has outpaced human categories of understanding by millions of years. The vocabulary breaks down, the conceptual frameworks bend and warp under the pressure of trying to hold something that exceeds their design specifications. Human language evolved to describe human experience, and human experience, for all its richness and complexity, is the experience of beings who have been technologically sophisticated for perhaps 12,000 years, who have been engaging in organized philosophical inquiry for perhaps 3,000 years, and who have been exploring the physical nature of the universe with scientific instruments for perhaps 400 years. The Arcturians have been doing all of those things for time periods that make those numbers look like rounding errors. So when we describe them, we are always working at the edge of language, always reaching for approximations that gesture toward a reality they cannot fully contain. With that caveat firmly in place, let us try to understand what the Arcturian civilization actually is, because understanding it is essential to understanding both why they are in conflict with the Draconians and why that conflict matters to every person alive on this planet today. The Arcturian civilization is described consistently across sources that had no contact with one another as a civilization that has undergone what various frameworks call ascension. This word, drawn from religious traditions that use it to describe transcendence of the physical plane, is one of the most misunderstood and most important words in the lexicon of contact research. Ascension, in this context, does not mean disappearance. It does not mean death or dissolution into nothingness or withdrawal from engagement with the physical universe. It means a shift in the fundamental mode of existence, a transition from a state in which consciousness is primarily anchored in dense physical matter, in bodies that age and die, and are subject to the full range of biological imperatives and limitations, to a state in which consciousness operates at a higher frequency, in which the relationship to matter becomes more fluid and more chosen, in which the being retains individuality, but that individuality is no longer defined by or limited to a single physical body in a single physical location. The Arcturians are described as existing in what is called fifth-dimensional consciousness. To understand what this means, it helps to build up from lower dimensions. Third-dimensional consciousness is what most humans experience in ordinary waking life, a state in which the self is perceived as a bounded individual, separate from other selves, moving through linear time in a single body, subject to the physical laws of the material world. Fourth-dimensional consciousness introduces a greater awareness of time as a non-linear field, a greater permeability of the boundaries between self and other, a greater sensitivity to the energetic and emotional dimensions of experience that tend to be filtered out by strictly third-dimensional perception. Fifth-dimensional consciousness, as described by the Arcturians themselves in the channeled communications that form a significant part of the contact literature, is a state in which the illusion of separation between individual consciousness and the larger field of consciousness in which all individual experience arises is largely transparent, in which the being perceives and operates simultaneously at the level of the individual and at the level of the collective, in which compassion is not an emotional state that comes and goes, but a permanent and active orientation toward all other beings, and in which the capacity to affect reality through focused intention far exceeds anything available to beings operating in third-dimensional modes. This does not make the Arcturians omnipotent. It is important to understand this clearly because the temptation, once you begin to appreciate the scale of their development, is to cast them as gods, as beings of unlimited power who could simply resolve the conflict with the Draconians and the difficult situation of humanity by an act of will if they chose to. This is not the case. The Arcturians operate within a framework of laws that govern the interaction of consciousness at every level. Laws that are not arbitrary rules imposed by some external authority, but are intrinsic to the structure of reality itself. The most fundamental of these laws, the one that appears most frequently and most emphatically in everything the Arcturians communicate about their relationship to humanity, is the law of free will. This law holds that consciousness at every level of development has the right to choose its own path, to make its own mistakes, to learn through its own experience, and that no being, however advanced, however well-intentioned, has the right to override that freedom. This law is not merely a philosophical preference for the Arcturians. It is the foundation of their entire ethical system, the principle from which all their other principles derive, and the constraint that defines and limits their engagement with developing civilizations, including ours. The implications of this constraint are enormous. It means that the Arcturians cannot simply remove the Draconian presence from Earth by force, even if they have the power to do so, because doing so would violate the free will of the beings, including humans, who are engaged in the learning experience that the conflict represents. It means that they cannot directly intervene in human affairs at a level that would override human choice, even when they see human beings making choices that will lead to suffering. It means that their primary mode of engagement with humanity has been and continues to be influence rather than control, guidance rather than direction, the provision of information and energy and perspective rather than the imposition of solutions. This is why when we look at the history of Arcturian engagement with this planet, what we find is not a story of dramatic, unmistakable intervention, not a story of spaceships landing in broad daylight and authoritative beings stepping out to tell humanity what to do. What we find instead is a story of whispered influence, of dreams and visions, of individuals who suddenly and inexplicably know something they were not taught, of moments of profound spiritual insight that arrive without warning and change the trajectory of a life or an era, of healings that cannot be explained by any known mechanism, of contact experiences that are almost always ambiguous, always deniable, always leaving the experiencing human with the responsibility of integration and interpretation. The Arcturian civilization developed what various sources describe as a specific role within the galactic community, a role built around what they call healing and record-keeping. The healing aspect refers not to medical practice in the narrow sense, though the Arcturians are described as possessing medical and biological knowledge of extraordinary depth, but to the broader work of supporting the vibrational health of planets, civilizations, and individual beings. The Arcturian understanding of health operates at the level of what they call the light body or the energetic template, the non-physical structure that underlies and organizes the physical form of any living being. In their framework, all physical illness, all social dysfunction, all civilizational pathology is a downstream expression of disruption at the energetic level. Disruption caused by trauma, by the influence of negative entities, by misalignment with the fundamental frequency of the being's own higher self. The work of healing in the Arcturian understanding is always the work of restoring alignment, of clearing interference, of helping a being or a civilization remember its own essential nature and return to the frequency that is its truest expression. The record-keeping aspect of the Arcturian mission refers to their role as what might be called the librarians of the galaxy. The Arcturians are described as maintaining what various sources call the Akashic records, the cosmic repository of all experience, all thought, all action that has ever occurred anywhere in the universe. This concept appears in various forms across multiple human spiritual traditions, including Hindu cosmology, where the Akasha is described as the fundamental medium of existence in which all events are permanently recorded. and in Western esoteric traditions where the Akashic records are described as a kind of universal memory accessible to sufficiently developed consciousness. The Arcturian connection to this repository is described as both custodial and active. They maintain it, yes, but they also draw upon it in their work with other civilizations, using the accumulated wisdom of billions of years of cosmic experience to inform the guidance they offer to younger worlds trying to navigate challenges that have already been faced and resolved in various forms many times before. The Arcturian civilization is organized to the extent that human political vocabulary can be applied to it as a kind of council-based collective. The hierarchy that exists is a hierarchy of wisdom and service rather than of power and coercion. Those who have developed the greatest capacity for compassionate action, the deepest understanding of the laws of consciousness, and the broadest perspective across galactic time are looked to for guidance. But this guidance is never imposed. The Arcturian social structure appears to be one in which there is no fundamental tension between individual and collective, because the experience of separation that generates that tension in human societies has been substantially dissolved. The individual Arcturian is not subsumed by the collective. Rather, the individual participates in the collective as a cell participates in a body, fully itself, fully coherent as a distinct entity, while simultaneously embedded in and contributing to a larger living system that it both shapes and is shaped by. Their technology, to the extent that they use what we would recognize as technology, is described as operating through principles of consciousness rather than through the manipulation of dead matter. Where human technology uses energy to act on materials that are treated as passive, Arcturian technology works in cooperation with the living intelligence of the universe, using consciousness to organize energy and matter in ways that achieve desired outcomes without the destructive side effects that characterize so much of what humans have developed. Their ships, for those who have encountered them, are described not as mechanical vessels, but as living craft, beings in their own right, grown rather than built, responsive to the consciousness of those traveling within them, capable of navigating not just physical space, but the spaces between dimensions. Their healing technologies work with light and sound at frequencies beyond normal human perception, directly addressing the energetic template of the being treated, rather than attempting to correct physical symptoms through physical interventions. The picture that emerges of Arcturian civilization is one of extraordinary coherence, a civilization that has resolved internally the fundamental tensions that tear at developing civilizations, including our own, and that has found a way to exist in a state of permanent orientation toward growth, toward beauty, toward the deepening of wisdom and the expansion of love. It is a civilization that has looked at the full arc of conscious experience in the galaxy, the suffering and the splendor, the cycles of destruction and renewal, the agonizing slowness of the spiritual development of younger species, and that has concluded, not from naivety, but from a sophistication of understanding that encompasses everything we would think of as tragedy and everything we would think of as triumph, that the universe is fundamentally oriented toward the good, that behind and beneath all the conflict, all the darkness, all the apparent evidence that meaninglessness and destruction are the final word, there is a movement, slow almost beyond perception, but absolutely real, toward greater consciousness, greater compassion, greater unity. This is what the Arcturians are fighting to protect when they engage in the conflict with the Draconians. Not just the human species, not just the Earth, not just this particular corner of the galaxy. They are fighting to protect the possibility of that movement continuing, because what the Draconian civilization represents, in the Arcturian understanding, is not just a military or political threat. It represents a philosophical threat, a civilizational argument that the universe is not oriented toward the good, that consciousness is not moving toward greater unity and compassion, that the dominant logic of existence is not love, but power, and that beings who organize themselves around that logic are simply being more honest about the nature of reality than those who refuse to do so. The Arcturians have been watching this philosophical argument play out on the Earth, in human history, in human institutions, in the human mind itself, for as long as humans have existed. They have seen the Draconian argument embedded in human culture, in the hierarchies of domination that characterize so much of recorded history, in the economic systems that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few, in the religious institutions that use the fear of divine punishment to enforce compliance and suppress the individual's direct experience of the divine, in the political structures that treat the many as resources to be managed for the benefit of the few. And they have been, within the constraints of the law of free will, consistently working to offer an alternative, to introduce, through the individuals who are open to receiving it, a different vision of what human civilization could be, one organized not around domination and control, but around the same principles of healing, of record-keeping, of service, and of love that organize their own. The Arcturian connection to Earth does not begin with the arrival of the human species. It begins much earlier, with the Earth itself, with the period of the planet's development in which the conditions for the kind of life that would eventually evolve into the human form were being established. The Arcturians describe a long program of what might be called planetary cultivation, a process in which the energetic template of the Earth was carefully developed. The grid of consciousness that underlies its physical structure was seeded and maintained. The vibrational frequency of the planet was tuned to support the development of the kind of life that could eventually house the level of consciousness that the human experiment required. This work was not done in isolation. It was done in collaboration with other civilizations that shared the Arcturian commitment to the Earth project. But the Arcturian contribution was, by multiple accounts, central. Their particular gifts, their skill with consciousness, with healing, with the maintenance of energetic structures, made them uniquely suited to the work of preparing a planet for the development of a species of the complexity and potential of the human. This is why the Arcturian relationship to humanity is described as familial rather than merely advisory. They did not simply show up when we became interesting. They were involved in the preparation of the conditions that made us possible. They invested in the deep time before human memory, the kind of energy and attention that creates something like love, something like responsibility. The human species, from the Arcturian perspective, is in some sense their work, not in the sense that they created it unilaterally or that they own it, because neither of those things is true, and both would violate the principles of free will and collaborative development that are fundamental to the Arcturian ethical framework, but in the sense that they have been present, engaged, caring, and invested in the human experiment for longer than the experiment has been running. The Arcturians also maintain what they describe as a permanent energetic presence in close proximity to the Earth, a fleet of vessels operating at frequencies above normal human visual perception, positioned in what they call the higher etheric realms around the planet, engaged in continuous work to maintain the energetic health of the Earth and its inhabitants, to deflect or mitigate the more extreme expressions of draconian interference, and to transmit, through a variety of channels, the guidance and healing frequencies that are available to any human being who opens to receiving them. This fleet, described in contact literature under various names, is often called the Arcturian Starship Athena or the Arcturian Corridor, a specific energetic pathway between Arcturus and Earth through which both information and consciousness can travel. The existence of this corridor and the continuous activity of Arcturian presence in the space around Earth is one of the most consistent elements across decades of contact testimony, and it forms one of the primary mechanisms through which the Arcturian engagement with humanity operates in the present day. Understanding the Arcturian civilization in its depth and complexity is not merely academic context for the conflict we are describing. It is essential to understanding what is actually at stake in that conflict. Because the Draconians have never been simply fighting for territory, for resources, or for strategic position in a military sense. What they have been fighting for, at the deepest level, is the soul of the human species. They have been fighting to determine whether the extraordinary potential encoded in the human genome will develop in a direction that serves their interests, or in a direction that serves the vision the Arcturians and other benevolent civilizations hold for humanity's future. The Draconians are not simply an enemy to be defeated. They are the embodiment of a philosophy, a way of understanding the universe, that the human species has been absorbing and expressing and fighting within itself for all of recorded history. Defeating them, if that is even the right frame, requires not military victory, but something far harder: the genuine transformation of human consciousness, the liberation of the human spirit from the frameworks of domination and fear that the Draconian presence has worked for millennia to keep in place. The Arcturians know this. It is why, despite their capabilities, they have never chosen a purely military strategy in relation to the Draconian presence on Earth. It is why their entire engagement with this planet is oriented toward awakening, toward the activation of the potential within human consciousness itself, toward supporting the development of the very capacity in human beings that would render Draconian influence ineffective. Because a human being who has truly awakened to their own nature, who has genuinely contacted the level of their being that connects them to the larger field of cosmic consciousness, is not vulnerable to the tools of Draconian control in the same way that a human being asleep to that nature is vulnerable. Fear cannot hold someone who has faced the nature of consciousness directly. Hierarchy cannot dominate someone who knows their own sovereignty. Deception cannot disorient someone whose inner compass is calibrated to truth rather than to the manufactured consensus of a controlled reality. This is the gift the Arcturians are offering, and have been offering for as long as they have been engaged with this world. Not rescue, not a solution handed down from above, not the kind of salvation that requires nothing from the one being saved, but the support, the guidance, the healing frequencies, and the compassionate witnessing that make it possible for humanity to do the actual work of its own liberation. The work that no being can do for another, and that every being eventually must do for themselves. With this picture of the Arcturian civilization in place, we are ready to turn to the other side of the conflict, to the civilization that represents, in the starkest possible terms, everything the Arcturians are working to counterbalance. The civilization whose fingerprints are on the most disturbing chapters of human history, whose agenda runs through the structures of power that human beings have been born into and suffered under for thousands of years, and whose presence in the affairs of this planet is, for reasons that will become very clear, significantly harder to see than the Arcturian presence, because it does not want to be seen, because invisibility is one of its primary strategies, because the most effective form of control is the kind that the controlled do not recognize as control. We are now going to go into the Draconian civilization, into its origins, its philosophy, its structure, its history, and its specific agenda with regard to the planet Earth and the human species. This part of the story is darker. It is more disturbing. It involves facts and claims that challenge almost every comfortable assumption about the nature of human society and human history. But it is also, if you are willing to follow it to its conclusions, ultimately a story about the limits of darkness rather than its triumph, because the Draconians have been working on this planet for a very long time, with resources and capabilities that dwarf anything humanity has developed, and the human species is still here, still fighting, still reaching, in its best moments, towards something the Draconians cannot provide and cannot ultimately prevent. That fact matters. It matters enormously, and we will return to it. The Draconian Empire, the architecture of dominion. The Draco constellation covers an enormous sweep of the northern sky. It is one of the largest constellations in the celestial sphere, a sinuous, winding formation of stars that the ancient Greeks identified with the dragon, the serpent, the creature of primal power that winds through the mythologies of virtually every culture on Earth. In Norse mythology, it is the great serpent Jörmungandr encircling the world. In Hindu cosmology, it appears as the serpent Shesha upon which the universe rests. In ancient Mesopotamia, the first enemy of the gods was the great dragon Tiamat. In the foundational narrative of the Judeo-Christian tradition, the serpent is the figure through which humanity's original innocence is corrupted and its subjection to suffering and mortality is established. In Chinese cosmology, the dragon is a symbol of imperial power, of the emperor's divine authority to rule. In Mesoamerican tradition, the feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya, is the civilizing deity who brought knowledge and culture to humanity. The serpent, the dragon, the reptilian being of vast intelligence and power, appears in the founding stories of civilization after civilization, and it appears almost never as a neutral figure. It appears either as the great enemy or as the great ruler, as the force against which the heroic must struggle, or as the ultimate authority to which the mortal must submit. This is not coincidence, it is memory. The human species has been encoding its experience of the Draconian civilization in its mythological structures for as long as it has had mythological structures. The stories vary in their specifics, in the moral weight they assign to the serpentine figure, in the relationship they describe between the dragon and humanity. But the presence of the figure itself, across every culture, across every era, is a datum that demands explanation. And the explanation that emerges from the contact literature, from the regression testimony, from the traditions of those cultures that preserved explicit cosmological knowledge rather than fragmentary mythology, is that the figure appears in the stories because the being it represents appeared in history, not as a symbol, not as a metaphor, as an actual civilization with actual ships, actual intentions, and an actual agenda that has shaped the development of human society in ways so fundamental that most humans cannot see the shaping because they are standing inside it. The Draconian civilization originates, according to the preponderance of sources, in the Draco constellation, most specifically in the star system around Alpha Draconis, known also by its traditional name Thuban. Thuban is interesting in its own right. It was the pole star of the ancient Egyptians, the star toward which the descending passages of the Great Pyramids at Giza are pointed, the star that marked the celestial north during the era in which those structures were built. The alignment of the pyramids to Thuban has been noted and discussed in mainstream archaeological literature, though the implications of that alignment, in the context of the story we are telling, have not been explored in mainstream scholarship. If the Draconian civilization is connected to Thuban, and if the pyramids were built under the direction or influence of beings connected to that civilization, then the alignment is not an arbitrary astronomical reference. It is a statement of ownership, or of allegiance, or of communication directed at the sky. The Draconian civilization is reptilian in its physical form. This is described consistently across contact reports and regression testimony that emerged independently across decades and across cultural boundaries. The beings described are tall, significantly taller than average humans, with scales rather than skin, with eyes that differ from mammalian eyes in their structure and their quality, with a physical presence that witnesses consistently describe as overwhelming, as generating in the human nervous system a response somewhere between awe and primal terror, a response that appears to be not merely psychological but biological, as if the mammalian body retains at some deep level of its programming a recognition of the reptilian predator that is older than language and older than culture. The Draconian civilization is organized according to a strict caste system, one of the most rigid and elaborated hierarchical structures described in the contact literature. At the apex of this hierarchy are beings described as the Royal Draconians, sometimes called the Chiakar or the Wingids, beings of exceptional size, often described as possessing wings, and described by witnesses as radiating a quality of psychic power and authority that makes the experience of being in their presence almost unbearable for most humans. These are the philosopher kings of the Draconian Empire, the beings whose intelligence and power are greatest, whose lives span what by human standards would be almost incomprehensible spans of time, and whose vision and strategy have guided the Draconian civilization through its long history of expansion. Below them are the warrior castes, the administrators, the workers, and at the bottom of the hierarchy, the servant classes, which in the Draconian system can include other species, beings that the Draconian civilization has conquered, enslaved, or genetically engineered to serve specific functions within the Empire's economic and military structures. The Draconian philosophical framework, the worldview that underlies all of this structure, is one of the most coherent, and in its own terms, internally consistent philosophies ever developed by a conscious species. It is not a philosophy of evil, in the sense that it celebrates suffering or destruction for their own sake. The Draconians do not consider themselves villains. They consider themselves realists. Their philosophy holds that the fundamental nature of the universe is predatory, that consciousness at every level is engaged in a competition for energy and resources, that this competition is the engine of all development and the source of all meaning, and that beings who pretend otherwise, who construct philosophies of cooperation and altruism and universal love, are either naive or are lying, using the language of virtue to conceal the reality of their own will to power. This philosophy has a name in the contact literature. It is called the philosophy of service to self, or sometimes the philosophy of polarity. Its adherents argue that the pursuit of personal power, the accumulation of control over others and over resources, the willingness to dominate rather than to be dominated, is not merely pragmatic, but is spiritually correct, is in alignment with the true nature of the universe, and is the path toward the highest possible development of consciousness. They argue that compassion, as understood by beings like the Arcturians, is a form of weakness, a dilution of individual power through unnecessary entanglement with the concerns of others. They argue that the strong have not merely the right, but the cosmic obligation to rule the weak, because the relationship of domination and subjugation is, in their framework, the fundamental driver of the evolution of consciousness, providing both the ruler and the ruled with experiences necessary for their development. It is important to spend a moment with this philosophy, uncomfortable as it is, because understanding it is essential to understanding the specific strategies the Draconians have employed in relation to the human species. They are not irrational. They are not operating without a coherent framework. They are following a philosophy with millennia of refinement, a philosophy that has produced a civilization of extraordinary military power, technological sophistication, and political reach. Understanding their logic is not the same as endorsing it, but trying to counter it without understanding it is like trying to play chess against an opponent whose strategy you have not bothered to study. You will always be reactive, always surprised, always a step behind. The Draconian civilization expanded through the galaxy using methods that directly reflect this philosophy. When they identified a planetary system of potential value, either for its resources, its strategic position, or its existing populations, they did not make contact in the manner of civilizations committed to the protocols of the Galactic Federation. They assessed the strength of what they found. If it was weak, they took it. If it was not weak, they used more sophisticated methods, infiltration, manipulation, the introduction of agents into the existing social structures of the target civilization, the gradual subversion of the target civilization's values, institutions, and leadership from within, until what had once been a sovereign world was effectively a subject world administered by its own population in the interests of its draconian overlords, and often unaware that those overlords existed or that their own leaders were taking direction from non-human sources. This method, which we will call the method of invisible empire, is the method the Draconians have applied to the Earth. It is the method that explains why, if you accept the framework we are building in this documentary, human history looks the way it does, why the same patterns of hierarchy, exploitation, and suppression appear in culture after culture, era after era, why the institutions of human civilization seem almost systematically designed to prevent the majority of human beings from developing their full potential, why the knowledge that would most empower individuals, whether spiritual, medical, historical, or cosmological, is most consistently suppressed, distorted, or weaponized against the very people it should serve. These are not accidents. They are not the inevitable outcomes of human nature. They are the products of a deliberate, long-term management strategy applied to a species that the Draconian civilization identified very early as both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because of what the human genome contains. The human body is described across the contact literature as a remarkable biological instrument, a vessel capable of channeling and expressing frequencies of consciousness that are extraordinarily high, extraordinarily powerful, and extraordinarily creative. The combination of physical density, which allows for material engagement with the full range of creative possibility in a physical universe, and the spiritual connection encoded in the DNA, which allows for access to frequencies of consciousness far beyond ordinary third-dimensional awareness, makes the human being something genuinely rare, a being capable of creating at the level of the divine while operating in the density of the material, a being capable, in its fully developed form, of producing effects in physical reality through consciousness alone that would seem miraculous from any lower level of development. The Draconians recognized this potential, and they recognized that if it were allowed to develop freely, it would produce beings whose power exceeded their own. This was unacceptable. Dangerous because of the sheer number of humans, the rapid rate of human reproduction, and the volatility of human consciousness, its unpredictability, its capacity for sudden leaps of understanding, its tendency to generate what the Draconians appear to regard as threats to the stability of controlled systems in the form of spiritual movements, revolutionary ideas, visionary leaders, and moments of collective awakening. Human beings, when they begin to wake up, are difficult to stop. The Draconian management strategy has always been oriented toward preventing that waking up from reaching a critical mass, toward keeping the volume of human consciousness turned down just enough that the most dangerous frequencies, the ones that would break the control systems entirely, cannot emerge and sustain themselves. The methods of this management strategy are multiple and layered, and we will examine them in detail in subsequent sections of this documentary. But the foundational method, the one upon which all others depend, is what the Draconian philosophy calls harvesting. The Draconians understand consciousness in energetic terms. They understand that conscious beings, particularly beings of the complexity and emotional range of humans, generate large quantities of what they describe as luch, a term that has entered the contact literature through multiple independent channels, and that refers to the energetic byproduct of strong emotional experience. Luch is described as a form of psychic energy that can be absorbed and used by beings capable of perceiving it. The Draconians are such beings, and the emotions that generate the most potent and most easily harvestable luch are the negative emotions: fear, rage, grief, despair, confusion, and suffering of all kinds. This is the deepest explanation for why the Draconian management of Earth has been so consistently oriented toward the generation and maintenance of human suffering, not because they are sadists, though the end effect is indistinguishable from sadism, but because suffering is their energy source. War, famine, economic deprivation, political oppression, religious persecution, all of the organized mechanisms through which large numbers of human beings are held in states of fear and misery generate, from the Draconian perspective, a continuous harvest of the energetic resource they require for the maintenance of their civilization at its current scale. The Earth, from this perspective, is not primarily a territory in the conventional sense. It is a farm, a very large, very carefully managed, very productive farm, managed for the benefit of its Draconian proprietors by a class of human administrators who may or may not understand what they are actually administering. The physical form of the Draconian presence on Earth is multifaceted. There are Draconian beings who exist in the physical third dimension on and within the Earth, in underground bases and facilities that have been reported across decades of testimony from military and government insiders, from abductees, and from indigenous traditions that have maintained knowledge of the interior world and its inhabitants across vast periods of time. There are beings who exist in the higher etheric dimensions adjacent to Earth, working at frequencies that prevent direct visual detection, but are capable of influencing physical reality, and particularly human consciousness, through energetic means. And there is what might be called the human-Draconian interface, the human beings who, through bloodline, through initiation, through agreements made in circumstances they may not fully understand, serve as the physical agents of the Draconian agenda in the human world. These are the beings that conspiracy research, when it makes contact with this level of the story, describes as the elite, as the bloodlines, as the secret societies and hidden orders that have managed human civilization behind the visible structures of governments and religions and economies. The bloodline connection is important because it is one of the most consistently reported elements across the widest range of sources, From ancient Sumerian texts to modern regression testimony, from the royal lineages of Egypt and Mesopotamia to the dynastic families that have dominated European and subsequently global power structures across the last several thousand years. The Draconian civilization, in its engagement with the Earth, did not merely influence humanity from a distance. It interacted directly with human populations at the biological level, introducing draconian genetic material into specific human bloodlines to create a hybrid class of beings with human bodies and significant human emotional and spiritual capacity, but with neurological and physiological modifications that make them more compatible with draconian consciousness, more resistant to the higher frequencies of Arcturian influence, and more effective as administrators of the control system. These hybrid bloodlines were then cultivated, maintained, and positioned across the millennia in the roles of kings, priests, merchants, and officials, the roles that gave them control over the resources, the knowledge, and the organizational structures of human civilization. The Sumerian tablets, among the oldest written records available to archaeology, described the Anunnaki, a group of beings who came from the sky, who created human beings through genetic manipulation of existing primates, and who established themselves as gods ruling over the human populations they created. Mainstream scholarship treats the Anunnaki as mythological, but the consistency of their description across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and subsequent traditions, the technical specificity of the processes described in the creation narratives, and the correlation between the Anunnaki's described characteristics and the draconian profile established through contact research are not easily dismissed. The Anunnaki are described as tall, as having a particular relationship to gold, which they mined using human labor, as establishing hierarchical social systems among humans that reflected their own hierarchical values, as interbreeding with human women to produce hybrid offspring, and as engaging in wars among themselves, wars that were felt by the human populations under their control as catastrophic events that reshaped the landscape of civilization. The Draconian Empire is not a monolithic entity. This is crucial to understand because the temptation, once you begin to appreciate the scale and coherence of the control system, is to imagine it as operating with a single, unified agenda implemented by a fully cooperative organization. The reality is more complex. The Draconian civilization, like all civilizations of its scale, contains internal tensions, competing factions, different strategic schools of thought about the best way to achieve the fundamental goals of empire. There are Draconian factions that favor a more direct approach, harder control, more explicit domination, less concern with maintaining the illusion of human freedom. There are other factions that favor the subtler approach, the invisible empire strategy, that recognize the value of a human population that believes itself to be free and therefore does not rebel, that understands the long game of consciousness management well enough to know that brute force is a less efficient tool than the carefully crafted belief system. These internal draconian tensions have played out on Earth in human history as conflicts between different elite factions, different empires, different power structures, each backed by different draconian interests. This is one of the explanations for the apparently self-contradictory behavior of the global elite, for the fact that the people who appear to be running the control system sometimes seem to be fighting each other as viciously as they fight the populations they are supposed to be managing. They are, in part, proxies for draconian internal politics playing out in the human theater. The humans involved rarely understand the full nature of what they are caught up in, but they feel its pull clearly enough, the sense of serving a power greater than themselves, the experience of resources and protection and information arriving through channels they cannot fully explain, the weight of what feels like destiny or divine mandate pressing them toward the maintenance and extension of systems that keep the mass of humanity in a state of managed limitation. The draconian presence on Earth has also worked directly through the manipulation of what might be called the frequency environment of the planet. Human consciousness is sensitive to frequency, to the vibrational environment in which it is immersed. The Draconians have developed sophisticated technologies and techniques for maintaining the frequency of the Earth and its human population within a range that suppresses the higher capacities of human consciousness. This works through multiple channels, through the manipulation of the electromagnetic field of the planet, through the introduction of substances into the human diet and environment that suppress the pineal gland, which is the biological interface between physical consciousness and higher dimensional awareness, through the organization of the built environment of human civilization in ways that reinforce, rather than relieve, the stress responses of the nervous system, and through the use of media, entertainment, and education systems to continuously fill human attention with content that maintains the frequencies of fear, distraction, and passive consumption, rather than the frequencies of inquiry, sovereignty, and spiritual development. None of this means that the Draconian position is impregnable. If it were impregnable, this documentary would have a very different conclusion. The Draconian civilization has been managing humanity for a very long time, and its management has been effective enough to prevent the kind of mass awakening that would fundamentally challenge its control. But it has never been able to prevent awakening entirely. The potential encoded in the human genome is too strong, the Arcturian and other benevolent presences too persistent, the inherent drive of consciousness toward the light too fundamental to the nature of what a human being is. The history of the suppression of human awakening is also the history of that suppression's repeated failure to be complete. Something always breaks through. Someone always remembers. The truth, buried under as many layers of lie and distraction as the Draconian system can generate, finds its way to the surface. This is the war, not a war of ships and weapons, though there have been those elements, not a war of political factions maneuvering for power, though that has been part of it too. At its deepest level, the war between the Arcturian and Draconian approaches to the question of what humanity is, and what humanity should be allowed to become, is a war over consciousness, over whether the extraordinary potential of the human being will be allowed to develop or will be permanently suppressed, over whether the human species will be shepherded into its full inheritance as a sovereign, conscious, creative force in the universe, or will remain what the Draconian management system requires it to be, a well-maintained herd of consciousness-generating beings, productive, compliant, and unaware of what they truly are. The next chapter of this story takes us back to the beginning of the conflict itself, to the first direct encounters between these two civilizations in the space near Earth, to the events of the deep past that established the terms of the engagement that continues to this day. This is where the story gets specific, where we move from cosmology into what might be called cosmic history, where the abstract opposition of philosophies becomes a concrete series of events with consequences that can be traced forward in time to the world we are living in right now. The first conflict, wars before human memory. The conflict between the Arcturian and Draconian civilizations did not begin at Earth. The Earth is not the origin of this war. It is, in some profound and terrible sense, the site of one of its later and most critical theaters, the place where the conflict reached a particular intensity because of the unique nature of what the Earth contains. But the war itself is older than the Earth, older than the solar system in which the Earth resides, a conflict that stretches back across galactic time in ways that make the deepest human history look like a recent development. To understand why the conflict came to Earth, we have to first understand something of what happened before it did. The galactic community, as we described in the opening section, is not a unified entity. It is a complex, layered network of civilizations at very different stages of development, organized around very different philosophical commitments, with very different relationships to the broader question of what the development of consciousness in the universe is supposed to look like and who is responsible for guiding it. The emergence of the Galactic Federation, the organizational structure that most clearly represents the Arcturian philosophical position, was itself a response to the emergence of the Draconian imperial model. The two developed in relationship to each other, each defining itself partly in opposition to the other, each gathering to its banner the civilizations whose values aligned most closely with its own organizing principles. The first major conflict between the Federation and the Draconian Empire, in the sources that address this history, is associated with a region of the galaxy known in various contact traditions as the Lyron system. Lyra, in the human constellation map, is a small northern constellation dominated by Vega, one of the brightest stars in the night sky. In the cosmological literature of contact research, Lyra holds a place of extraordinary importance because it is described as one of the earliest homes of what might be called the human prototype. the original form of the humanoid biological template that was eventually developed and diversified into the many humanoid species found across the galaxy, including the version that evolved on Earth. The beings of Lyra are described as among the oldest humanoid races in the galaxy, beings who developed consciousness and civilization in the deep past, and who seeded, directly or indirectly, many of the humanoid civilizations that subsequently developed across other star systems. The Draconian Empire's expansion brought it into contact with the Lyran civilizations at some point in the deep galactic past. The Lyrans, like the Arcturians, were committed to a philosophy of service and development rather than domination. They had built civilizations of great richness and sophistication, and they had no interest in being absorbed into the Draconian imperial system. The Draconians, following the logic of their philosophy, had no interest in being declined. The conflict that resulted is described in the contact literature as the Lyran Wars, and it is described as one of the most devastating conflicts in galactic history. The Draconian forces brought to bear the full weight of their military technology, weapons of a type that human physics has not yet developed, but that are described in terms of directed energy, of the weaponization of resonance and frequency at scales capable of affecting planetary bodies, of technologies that could alter the physical structure of a star system to make it uninhabitable. The Lyran Wars ended in what can only be described as a catastrophe for the Lyran civilizations. Multiple inhabited worlds were destroyed. The populations that survived scattered across the galaxy, becoming the seeds of many of the humanoid civilizations that exist in various star systems today, including, in the account given by multiple contact sources, the civilizations of the Pleiadians, the Sirians, and others who have played significant roles in the subsequent history of this region of space, and in the specific story of the Earth. The Arcturian civilization, which had a different relationship with the Lyrans and was not directly involved in the initial conflict, was confronted with the evidence of what the Draconian philosophy looked like in its military expression, and this confrontation was formative for the Arcturian understanding of what the Draconian civilization represented as a threat to the larger galactic community. The Lyran refugees who scattered across the galaxy carried with them something that the Draconians had been trying to eliminate: the genetic template of the humanoid form with all its extraordinary spiritual potential. They carried it to new star systems, where they rebuilt their civilizations over the course of thousands of years, and where they continued the project of developing and refining the humanoid template that had originally developed in Lyra. The Draconians, aware of this, pursued a persistent policy of either destroying or subjugating the humanoid civilizations wherever they re-established themselves, a policy that has been described across the contact literature as a galaxy-wide campaign of suppression directed specifically at the humanoid biological form, because the Draconians recognized in that form the seed of a level of consciousness that could, if it developed fully, challenge Draconian dominance. This is the galactic context in which the Earth becomes significant. The Earth, with its extraordinary biological richness, its specific energetic position in the galactic grid, and the specific combination of conditions that it offered for the development of life, was identified at some point in the deep past as an ideal laboratory for the next phase of the humanoid project. The Lyran refugees and their successors, working in collaboration with the Arcturians and other members of the Galactic Federation, identified the Earth as a world where the humanoid template could be introduced into an already rich evolutionary substrate, where the specific combination of the terrestrial mammalian evolutionary lineage and the genetic heritage of the stars could produce something new, something that might represent the next major step in the development of humanoid consciousness. A being that would combine the spiritual depth of the cosmic heritage with the creative power of full embodiment in dense physical matter. A being that was both ancient and new, both human and divine, both limited and potentially unlimited. The being we call the human. The decision to make Earth the primary site of this experiment was not made without awareness of the risk. The Draconian civilization was also aware of the Earth's potential. It had its own observers in this region of space, its own interest in the biological richness of the planet, and its own agenda with regard to the humanoid project. From the moment the decision was made to develop the humanoid template on Earth, The conflict over Earth was implicit because the Draconians would never willingly allow the full development of a species whose potential represented an eventual threat to their dominance. The early history of the Earth's development as a site of conscious experiment involved what the contact literature describes as a series of civilizational cycles, periods of human or proto-human development that rose to considerable heights of complexity before being terminated, usually violently, by some combination of natural and artificial catastrophe. The geological record of the Earth contains evidence of multiple extinction events and civilizational disruptions, events whose scale and timing do not always fit comfortably into the conventional natural cause explanations offered by mainstream geology and archaeology. The mainstream explanation for the Permian extinction, the Cretaceous extinction, and the more recent Younger Dryas catastrophe, the cataclysm that ended the last ice age with startling abruptness approximately 12,000 years ago and wiped out most of the megafauna of the northern hemisphere, while also apparently terminating what multiple researchers have identified as a sophisticated pre-ice age civilization, relies on natural mechanisms, asteroid impacts, volcanic episodes, rapid climate shifts. These mechanisms may indeed have been involved, but the contact literature suggests that not all of the civilizational terminations in Earth's history were purely natural events. The Draconian civilization had the capability to engineer catastrophe. The same frequency and resonance technologies that had been used to devastate the Lyron worlds could be applied at smaller scales to terminate specific civilizational developments on a specific planet without destroying the planet itself. If a humanoid civilization on Earth developed to a point where it represented a threat to draconian control, where the level of consciousness emerging in the population exceeded the range that the draconian management system could effectively contain, the draconian response, according to this framework, was to reset, to terminate that specific civilizational development and start the cycle again from a lower baseline, leaving the population reduced in number, reduced in technological capability, and reduced in the accumulated knowledge that had allowed the dangerous development to occur. This framework, dark as it is, provides a coherent explanation for one of the most persistent mysteries in the study of human history, the mystery of the amnesia. Human beings appear to have lost enormous quantities of knowledge at multiple points in their history. The knowledge that allowed the construction of the great megalithic structures, the Giza complex, Göbekli Tepe, Pumapunku, the Nazca lines, and dozens of other sites whose engineering precision exceeds what should have been possible given the conventional reconstruction of the technology available at the time of their construction. The knowledge preserved in the astronomical, mathematical, and medical traditions of ancient civilizations that, on the conventional timeline, should not yet have developed what those traditions demonstrate they possessed. The knowledge encoded in the myths and sacred texts of cultures worldwide of a golden age, a time before the catastrophe, when humanity lived differently, knew more, and was more directly connected to the divine sources from which its existence sprang. The amnesia is not accidental. It is not simply the result of the fragility of pre-literate knowledge preservation systems. It is the product of repeated, deliberate civilizational reset, combined with an ongoing management strategy specifically designed to prevent the recovery and reintegration of the lost knowledge. The burning of libraries, the persecution of those who preserved forbidden knowledge, the appropriation and distortion of spiritual traditions, the encoding of the most important knowledge in symbolic systems that became inaccessible once the cultural context that held the key to their interpretation was destroyed. All of these can be understood as components of a long-term management strategy aimed at keeping the human population in a permanent state of civilizational infancy, always starting over, never able to build on what was learned in the previous cycle, never reaching the critical threshold of development where the full potential of the human being could emerge and sustain itself. The first direct conflict between Arcturian and Draconian forces in the vicinity of Earth, as described in the contact literature, is associated with this period of civilizational cycling. The Arcturians and their allies in the Galactic Federation were not passive observers of what the Draconians were doing to the human project. They engaged, both at the energetic level, working to maintain the frequency environment that supported human development against Draconian frequency manipulation, and at the level of direct physical intervention, operating within the constraints of galactic law regarding the conduct of conflict near inhabited worlds. These constraints are significant. They prohibit the use of weapons capable of causing mass casualties in planetary populations. They require that civilizations under the protection of the Federation be offered the opportunity to exercise their own free will in the conflict, and they establish the distinction between defensive engagement and offensive war in ways that have sometimes limited the Arcturian response to Draconian actions. There were periods in which the Arcturian and allied forces were able to establish a degree of protection around the Earth that significantly constrained Draconian activity. There were also periods in which the Draconian presence was dominant, in which the management system was most fully in place, in which the civilizational resets occurred, and the human knowledge base was most severely diminished. The ebb and flow of this conflict maps, in ways that researchers have begun to identify, onto the cyclical rises and falls of human civilization that the archaeological and mythological record preserves. The specific event most widely referenced in the contact literature as a decisive early moment in this conflict is associated with what multiple traditions call the Fall, the Great Catastrophe, the end of the Golden Age. This event, or series of events, which various traditions date to between 12,000 and 50,000 years ago, depending on the tradition and the specific catastrophe being referenced, is described as the moment when the Draconian influence most fully took hold of human civilization, when the connection between the human species and its cosmic heritage was most severely disrupted, and when the amnesia that has characterized human civilization ever since was most deliberately and comprehensively established. The civilization or civilizations that existed on Earth before this catastrophe are referred to in the contact literature and in various human traditions under names that have become deeply embedded in human cultural memory: Atlantis, Lemuria, Mu, Hyperborea. The mainstream academic position on these traditions is that they are myth, elaborated versions of folk memories of localized natural disasters, or purely invented utopias with no historical basis. But the consistency of these traditions across cultures that had no contact with each other, the presence of specific technical and geographical details that correlate across separate accounts, and the growing body of geological and archaeological evidence for advanced pre-Holocene civilization are making the dismissive mainstream position increasingly difficult to maintain. The civilization most extensively described in the contact literature, and the one most directly relevant to the conflict we are examining, is Atlantis. What is described, across the most detailed and most consistent accounts, is not the island utopia of popular imagination, but a sophisticated global civilization that had developed, under the guidance of beings from beyond the Earth, a technology that combined physical and consciousness principles in ways that gave it extraordinary power. A technology based on the manipulation of crystal structures that could channel and amplify specific frequencies of consciousness energy. A technology that could heal, could build, could communicate across vast distances, and could, when misused, cause catastrophic damage. The Draconian strategy with respect to Atlantis was not to destroy it immediately, it was to infiltrate it, to introduce, through the bloodline hybrid strategy we described earlier, a class of Atlantean leadership that gradually shifted the civilization's orientation from service to others, from the collaborative development of human potential guided by the Arcturian and allied civilizations, toward the service-to-self model, toward the use of the advanced technologies for power and for domination, including, in the final stages of Atlantean history, the attempt to use those technologies to permanently suppress human consciousness at a planetary scale. The internal conflict within Atlantean civilization between those who maintained the original vision and those who had been influenced by the Draconian philosophy reached a crisis point, and the catastrophe that destroyed Atlantean civilization was, in this account, at least partly the result of the reckless use of the crystal technologies by the faction that had been captured by Draconian influence, combined with natural geological instabilities that those technologies triggered or amplified. The survivors of Atlantis scattered across the globe, carrying fragments of the Atlantean knowledge to Egypt, to Mesoamerica, to the Indus Valley, to the island civilizations of the Pacific, and to other locations where they became the seeds of what are now called the Great Ancient Civilizations. The knowledge they carried was fragmentary because the catastrophe had been complete enough to destroy most of the archives and most of the practitioners of the full tradition. And the knowledge that arrived in these new locations was subsequently subjected to the same draconian management strategy. It was co-opted, distorted, and where possible eliminated, the most powerful elements suppressed, and the remainder reorganized into structures that serve the control agenda rather than the liberation of human consciousness. This is the deep history. This is the soil in which the more recent history of the human species, the history that begins with Sumer and Egypt and the Bronze Age civilizations, is rooted. And it is a history that is not over. The same conflict that played out in Atlantis, the same tension between the Arcturian vision and the Draconian agenda, the same struggle between human potential and the management systems designed to prevent that potential from developing, is playing out right now in this era in forms that are adapted to the specific circumstances of the 21st century, but that represent, at their core, the same ancient war. Understanding how that war shaped the ancient human civilizations that we can still see in the archaeological record, the civilizations that left monuments and texts and traditions that human beings have been staring at for centuries trying to understand, requires moving to the next phase of the story, the phase in which the draconian presence took on its most direct and explicit form in human history, in which the beings who had previously operated from more of a distance established themselves as the gods of the ancient world, demanding worship and obedience and the sacrifice of lives, and in which the Arcturian and allied response took the form of the teacher beings, the beings of light who appeared in human traditions as the bringers of wisdom, the civilizers, the ones who taught humanity the arts of agriculture and medicine and astronomy and law, not as rulers, but as guides. The gods among us, ancient civilizations as battleground. When human beings began writing down the stories of their gods, they were not composing mythology in the sense that the modern academic tradition uses that word. They were writing history. They were recording, in the symbolic and narrative forms available to them, the actual experiences of their civilizations with beings that were not human, beings that came from the sky, beings that had power over life and death, over weather and harvest, and the movements of armies, beings whose physical forms, in the case of some of them, were explicitly non-human and were described as such without any indication that the scribes considered this unusual or metaphorical. The gods of the ancient world were not invented to explain natural phenomena. They were not projections of the human unconscious. They were, at least in their earliest and most direct forms, literal beings that human populations were in direct contact with, beings whose presence shaped the organization of those populations, whose demands structured the economies and social hierarchies of the earliest civilizations, and whose conflicts with each other were experienced by their human subjects as wars, famines, floods, and the catastrophic collapse of the civilizational structures those subjects had built. When we lay the major mythological traditions of the ancient world side by side, what emerges is not a chaotic diversity of unrelated stories, but a convergence around a relatively small number of core themes and core narrative structures. There is almost always a pantheon, a group of powerful beings who rule over specific domains, who have specific personalities and specific relationships with each other, and who relate to the human population simultaneously as creators, as rulers, and as competitors for the worship and the energy that human devotion generates. There is almost always a conflict within the pantheon, a division between factions with opposed interests and opposed attitudes toward the human population. There is almost always a great catastrophe, a flood, a fire, a war in heaven that marks a transition from an earlier era to the current one. And there is almost always a teaching being, a being associated with wisdom and with the transmission of knowledge to humanity, who operates differently from the ruling gods, whose relationship to the human is more benevolent, more oriented toward human development than toward human subjugation. These consistent elements across traditions are the traces left in human cultural memory by the actual dynamic between the Arcturian and Draconian presences in the ancient world. The conflicted pantheon, the gods who fight each other and use human populations as their proxies, is the cultural encoding of the Draconian internal factional conflicts played out through their human subject populations. The Great Catastrophe is the cultural memory of the civilizational resets, the moments when the Draconian Draconian management system chose to terminate a specific civilizational development that had exceeded the range of acceptable development, and the teaching being the figure who brings wisdom, who instructs humanity in arts that the ruling gods had withheld, who is almost always punished by the other gods for this instruction, is the Arcturian and allied presence, expressing itself within the constraints of the management system, doing what it can to introduce the knowledge of human sovereignty and divine nature into a population being actively kept from that knowledge. The Promethean myth is the most famous expression of this figure in the Western tradition. Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to humanity. Fire, in this context, is not merely the literal ability to produce combustion. It is the symbolic representation of gnosis, of the divine spark, of the knowledge that the human being contains within itself the same fundamental consciousness that the gods themselves embody. The theft of this knowledge is punished by the ruling god, Zeus, with a punishment of extraordinary cruelty, eternal torture, the eagle that each day devours the liver that each night regenerates, the unending cycle of consumption that is an almost disturbingly accurate metaphor for the luch harvesting that the Draconian civilization practices with the human species. The myth encodes the entire dynamic. The benevolent being who shares the liberating knowledge is punished by the ruling order for doing so. The punishment itself is structured as a perpetual harvest. In Mesopotamia, the same dynamic appears in the figure of Enki, the Sumerian god of wisdom, water, and creation, who repeatedly intervenes to save humanity from the destructive intentions of other gods, most notably Enlil, who in multiple mythological episodes decides to destroy the human race through flood, famine, or plague, citing the excessive noise and multiplication of the human population as justification. The tension between Enki and Enlil is one of the most revealing in all of ancient mythology because it maps almost perfectly onto the tension we have been describing between the benevolent Arcturian orientation toward human development and the Draconian orientation toward human suppression and control. Enki creates, heals, and protects. Enlil controls, punishes, and restricts. Enki warns the human Utnapishtim of the coming flood that Enlil has arranged, allowing the preservation of the human bloodline and its genetic heritage. Enlil is furious when he discovers this intervention. The dynamic is not subtle. In Egypt, the equivalent dynamic plays out in the conflict between Osiris and Set. Osiris, the civilizing king, brings agriculture, law, and culture to humanity, representing the principle of order, of development, of the elevation of human life towards something more than survival. Set, his brother and murderer, represents chaos, domination, and the disruption of the development that Osiris represents. The mythology of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, with its themes of dismemberment and resurrection, of the search for the lost parts of the divine self, of the eventual triumph of the light principle over the dark, is one of the most elaborate and deeply encoded cosmological narratives in the ancient world, and its encoding of the conflict we are describing is so thorough that the priests of the Egyptian tradition devoted thousands of years to its preservation and elaboration. The specific character of Draconian presence in the ancient world varied by region and by era. In some cases, the Draconian beings appear to have had direct, physical, visible interaction with human populations, appearing in their actual physical forms, or in human forms. They were capable of maintaining through what various sources describe as a form of frequency manipulation that allowed them to appear human to third-dimensional perception while retaining their actual form at a higher dimensional level. The stories of the Naga, the serpent beings of Hindu and Buddhist tradition, beings of great intelligence and power who lived in underground kingdoms and who interacted with human civilization in ways that were sometimes beneficial and sometimes predatory, represent one cultural encoding of this direct physical presence. The Quetzalcoatl tradition, in which the feathered serpent is both a god and an actual being who walked among the Aztec and their predecessors, is another. In other cases, the Draconian presence operated through the hybrid bloodline strategy, through the human or near-human intermediaries who occupied the roles of kings and high priests and who maintained the control system without the direct physical presence of the draconian beings themselves being required. The divine kingship traditions of ancient civilizations, in which the ruler was literally identified as a god or as a direct descendant of the gods, requiring from the population the same worship and submission that would be directed to a divine being, are expressions of this strategy. The king is divine not because he has earned divinity through spiritual development, but because he carries in his blood the genetic material of beings who present themselves as gods. The population worships not the human individual, but the non-human heritage encoded in his lineage, and the energy of that worship flows through the intermediary of the bloodline king to the beings whose interests he actually serves. The religious systems of the ancient world, with their elaborate hierarchies of priests and initiates, their carefully maintained distinctions between the knowledge available to ordinary people and the knowledge available to those at higher levels of initiation, their sacrificial practices requiring the regular offering of blood and sometimes life, and their god concepts organized around themes of divine wrath, divine demand, and the requirement of human submission and obedience, are the most comprehensive expression of the draconian management system at the cultural level. They serve multiple functions simultaneously. They provide a framework within which the energy of human devotion and worship is organized and directed upward toward the beings at the top of the hierarchy. They provide a justification for the social hierarchies of domination that the control system requires. They provide a mechanism for suppressing the direct spiritual experience of the individual, replacing personal relationship with the divine with a managed, mediated, institutionally controlled version of religion that the institution can curate and regulate. And they provide a means of instilling the fear, the guilt, and the sense of fundamental unworthiness that are among the most effective tools for keeping human consciousness in the lower frequency ranges where the luch harvest is most productive. The Arcturian and allied response to all of this, as we noted, was constrained by the law of free will. They could not simply remove the draconian religious structures and replace them with something better, even if they had the physical power to do so, because the human populations embedded in those structures were not prisoners being held against their will in a way that was apparent to them. They were participants in a system they believed in, a system that met real psychological and social needs, and that they had the right to participate in and learn from, even if the system was ultimately designed to exploit rather than liberate them. The Arcturian response was therefore always indirect. The teacher who appeared within the tradition, who introduced elements into the existing religious framework that pointed toward the possibility of direct divine experience, that emphasized the inner kingdom rather than the external hierarchy, that taught that the divine was accessible to every individual without the mediation of a priestly class. The mystic, the prophet, the heretic, the one who says that God is not out there demanding submission, but in here, in the core of every being, available through sincerity and silence and love. These figures appear in every tradition, and they are almost always persecuted by the institutional religious structures they emerge within. Jesus, challenging the authority of the temple priesthood and teaching that the kingdom of God is within, crucified by the combined action of religious and imperial authority. Socrates, teaching that wisdom begins with the recognition of one's own ignorance and that the voice of the divine speaks directly to the individual conscience, executed for impiety. Al-Hallaj, the Sufi mystic who said on al-Haq, I am the truth, I am the divine reality, executed for heresy. Bruno, teaching the plurality of worlds and the infinity of the divine expression in the cosmos, burned at the stake by the Inquisition. The list is very long, and the pattern is very consistent. The teachers who point toward the individual's direct access to the divine are eliminated or marginalized by the institutions whose power depends on maintaining the monopoly on that access. In the ancient world, the Arcturian and allied presence also operated through direct physical contact with specific individuals who were prepared, through their own development and their own receptivity, to receive and transmit the frequencies and the knowledge that the Arcturian civilization was working to introduce. The initiatory traditions, the mystery schools that existed in Egypt, in Greece, in the Near East, in India, and in Mesoamerica, were in many cases channels through which this contact and transmission occurred. The beings encountered in the innermost chambers of the ancient mystery schools were not always entirely human. The experiences described by those who penetrated to the highest levels of the initiatory traditions are experiences of contact with non-human intelligence, contact that produced specific effects in the initiated, the dissolution of the fear of death, the direct experience of the continuity of consciousness beyond the physical body, the recognition of the cosmic nature of the self, and the activation of capacities of perception and healing that operated beyond the normal range of human capability. The ancient astronaut research that has developed over the last several decades has done important work in establishing that the ancient world was not isolated from non-human influences, that the knowledge bases of ancient civilizations reflect inputs that cannot be explained by the conventional model of independent indigenous development, that the engineering and astronomical and mathematical achievements of ancient civilizations require explanations that go beyond what the archaeological mainstream has been willing to consider. But much of this research stops at the threshold of the question we are asking here, because it identifies the presence of non-human intelligence in the ancient world without taking the next step of asking what the agenda of that intelligence was, whether all of the non-human influences on ancient civilization were oriented toward the same goals, and what the conflict between different non-human intelligences, expressed through their competing influences on human civilization, produced in the form of the history we can still trace. The conflict in the ancient world was not only a conflict between the Arcturian and Draconian influences at the level of human culture, religion, and politics. It was also, at various points, a direct physical conflict in the space around and on the Earth. The Vedic texts of India contain the most detailed and technically specific descriptions of aerial warfare in the ancient world, in the accounts of the Vimanas, the flying craft of the gods, and the Mahabharata's descriptions of weapons whose effects, read with 21st century eyes, are remarkably consistent with what we would recognize as energy weapons, particle beams, and nuclear or near-nuclear explosions. The description in the Mahabharata of a weapon that was like 1,000 suns, that reduced to ashes those it struck, that made survivors' hair and nails fall out and food become inedible, that required the survivors to submerge themselves in rivers to cleanse themselves of contamination, reads, in any honest assessment, very much like a description of a nuclear weapon and its aftermath. The standard academic response to this is that these are poetic elaborations of conventional warfare, but the specific technical details are harder to explain as poetic elaboration than as memory. The Sumerian texts describe conflicts among the Anunnaki, conflicts that involved the use of weapons of mass destruction, conflicts that left specific regions of the ancient Near East as wastelands, that destroyed specific cities, that produced the kind of rapid abandonment of formerly flourishing settlements that the archaeological record of certain ancient sites shows. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah in the Abrahamic tradition, occurring in a region that geological surveys have identified as showing evidence of extremely rapid, extremely intense heat events at approximately the time the tradition specifies, is one of the most studied instances of this pattern. The mainstream explanations, ranging from volcanic activity to comet airburst, account for the physical evidence. They do not account for the relationship between the event and the geopolitical dynamics of the Anunnaki, as described in the Sumerian texts, nor for the extraordinary preservation of specific human individuals who were warned in advance, as Lot was warned in advance, by beings they understood to be angels, which is the cultural encoding of beings from beyond the earth whose intervention in specific situations reflected specific agendas. The ancient world was not a primitive world waiting for civilization to arrive. It was a world in which civilization, at very high levels of sophistication, had already developed and been terminated multiple times, and in which the remnants of those civilizations, their knowledge, their bloodlines, their encoded traditions, were being carefully managed by the competing interests of the most ancient conflict in the galaxy. The monuments that remain from this era, the pyramids, the stone circles, the ancient temples, the alignment sites, are not merely engineering achievements. They are evidence of a contact with knowledge and with intelligence that the conventional historical model cannot explain. They are the physical residue of a civilization that was in direct relationship with beings from beyond this world, beings whose agenda for those civilizations was not uniform, beings whose competition with each other produced the turbulent, catastrophic, occasionally brilliant history of the ancient world that we are still trying to understand. The next step in this story brings us to the specific question of the human body itself, to the genetic history of the human species, to the evidence in the genome and in the archaeological record for the interventions that created the human being as we know it, and to the ongoing conflict over what that genome contains and what it could become if the management systems designed to suppress it were removed. This is the most intimate level of the conflict, the level at which the galactic war is not fought in space or in the political structures of human civilization, but in the very cells of the human body, in the DNA that carries the encoded potential of billions of years of cosmic development, and in the epigenetic switches that determine which of that potential is expressed and which remains dormant. The genetic war, DNA as the ultimate battlefield. The human genome contains approximately 3 billion base pairs of DNA. Of those 3 billion base pairs, approximately 2% are protein-coding genes, genes whose function is understood and whose contribution to the physical structure and biochemistry of the human body has been mapped with increasing precision since the completion of the Human Genome Project in 2003. The remaining 98% was, until relatively recently, dismissed by the mainstream scientific community with a label that has since been quietly revised: junk DNA. The implication of that label was clear. These vast stretches of the genome that did not code for proteins were evolutionary debris, accumulated errors, and outdated sequences that the genome had not bothered to eliminate, essentially meaningless from a functional standpoint. This position has been substantially abandoned as researchers have come to understand that much of what was called junk DNA serves regulatory functions, controlling which genes are expressed and when, governing the behavior of the genome at a systemic level in ways that are extraordinarily complex and that are still very far from fully understood. But the contact literature, and specifically the material that has come through multiple independent channels from sources identifying themselves as Arcturian or as connected to the benevolent galactic community, offers a different and far more radical interpretation of the so-called junk DNA. This interpretation holds that the non-protein coding portions of the human genome are not debris. They are not mistakes. They are the encoding, placed deliberately in the human genetic structure, of capacities that have not yet been activated, of potentials that exist in latent form waiting for the specific combination of environmental, energetic, and consciousness-level conditions that would trigger their expression. They represent, in short, the full inheritance that the human species was designed to carry: capacities for perception, for healing, for communication across space and time, for direct consciousness-to-consciousness contact without the mediation of physical technology, for the creation of effects in physical reality through focused intention that would make the fully expressed human being one of the most remarkable forms of conscious life in the galaxy. This is what the Galactic War is ultimately about. Not territory, not resources, at least not primarily. It is about whether those latent capacities will be allowed to express, whether the switches that turn them on will be flipped, whether the human species will be permitted to complete the development that its genome contains the instructions for. Because if it does, the implications are enormous. For the Arcturian vision, a fully expressed human being is a being capable of consciously participating in the galactic community as a sovereign partner, of contributing to the shared project of conscious development across the universe from a position of genuine power and understanding. For the Draconian agenda, a fully expressed human being is an uncontrollable variable, a being whose capacities exceed the tools available to maintain its subjugation, a threat to the Empire's investment in the Earth as a managed farm rather than a sovereign world. The genetic history of the human species, as told by the contact literature and as corroborated in suggestive if not conclusive ways by the actual findings of mainstream genetics, is a story of intervention. The human genome, as we have noted, shows anomalies that the standard model of evolution does not comfortably explain. The most frequently cited of these in the context of this discussion is the second chromosome. Human beings, unlike all other great apes, have 46 chromosomes. Every other great ape has 48. The two missing chromosomes in the human genome appear to have fused to form what is now chromosome 2 in the human genome, and the evidence for this fusion is clearly visible in the structure of chromosome 2, which retains the telomeric sequences that would normally be found only at the ends of chromosomes appearing in the middle of the fused structure, along with what appears to be a vestigial second centromere. This fusion is real and is documented. What is not agreed upon by mainstream science is whether it was the result of a random mutation that happened to be selectively advantageous, or whether it reflects an intentional modification introduced from outside the natural evolutionary process. The contact literature is unambiguous on this point. The chromosome fusion and numerous other modifications to the human genome were deliberate interventions by intelligences from beyond the Earth. The question of who made those interventions and for what purpose is where the conflict we have been describing enters the story of the human genome directly, because the testimony that has come through the contact research consistently identifies not one, but multiple rounds of genetic intervention in the human evolutionary lineage, and not all of those interventions were made by the same civilization or in pursuit of the same goals. The earliest interventions associated in the contact literature and in the surviving fragments of very ancient cosmological traditions with the Lyron heritage and its successors were oriented toward the development of the full potential of the humanoid template. The introduction of the genetic material that would eventually, through the Earth's evolutionary process, produce the human species was motivated by the vision we have described, the creation of a being that combined cosmic heritage with earthly embodiment, a being whose full development would represent a genuine contribution to the consciousness of the galaxy. These early interventions were careful, were oriented toward the long arc of development, and were designed to produce a being that could eventually activate the full range of its encoded potential in alignment with the principles of service, love, and conscious sovereignty. The Draconian interventions came later, and their purpose was precisely the opposite. Once the Draconian civilization recognized what was being developed in the Earth Project and recognized the threat that a fully developed human species would represent, they undertook their own genetic interventions, modifications to the human genome specifically designed not to add capacity but to suppress it, to insert sequences that would function as frequency blockers, reducing the sensitivity of the human nervous system to the higher dimensional frequencies that would otherwise naturally activate the latent potential in the genome, to modify the endocrine system, and particularly the pineal gland, in ways that reduced its function as an interface with higher consciousness, to introduce biological structures that would amplify the fear response, that would make the human nervous system chronically activated in the sympathetic mode, the fight-or-flight mode, in ways that kept the organism biologically oriented toward survival and away from the expanded states of consciousness in which its higher capacities could operate. The pineal gland deserves specific attention in this context. It is a small endocrine gland located in the geometric center of the brain between the two hemispheres, and it produces melatonin, the hormone that regulates the sleep-wake cycle. But its significance in esoteric and spiritual traditions far exceeds what mainstream medicine's understanding of its melatonin function would suggest. It is called the third eye in multiple traditions, the seat of the soul by Descartes, the organ of inner vision by virtually every system of mystical development across cultures and centuries. Research conducted by Rick Strassman and others has identified the pineal gland as a likely site of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, production in the human body. DMT is the most powerful psychedelic compound known, the active ingredient in ayahuasca, and a molecule that is produced not only in the human brain, but in virtually every living organism on Earth, from plants to mammals. It is a molecule of extraordinary significance for the question of consciousness, because the states it produces when humans are exposed to it are not states of confusion or random hallucination, but states of coherent, highly detailed, apparently intelligent contact with entities, with information, with dimensions of experience that are as real, by every subjective measure, as ordinary waking reality, and that produce in those who experience them profound and lasting transformations of worldview. The draconian modifications to the human pineal gland, according to the contact literature, were designed to suppress its function as a consciousness interface. The fluoride calcification of the pineal gland, which is now so common in adult humans living in fluoridated water environments that it is used as a normal finding in medical imaging, is understood in the contact framework not as a neutral or beneficial public health measure, but as a deliberately engineered suppression of the organ whose proper function would most directly undermine the draconian control system. The introduction of fluoride into public water supplies in the mid-20th century, justified on the basis of dental health benefits that subsequent research has substantially complicated, has produced a population in which the primary biological interface between physical consciousness and higher dimensional awareness is functionally impaired in the majority of adults. The significance of this, in the context of the conflict we are describing, is not subtle. The Arcturian response to the draconian genetic suppression strategy has operated on multiple levels. At the direct energetic level, the Arcturian presence around the Earth continuously transmits frequencies that support the reactivation of suppressed human genetic potential, frequencies that the contact literature describes as being specifically calibrated to the resonant frequencies of the sequences in the human genome that are currently dormant. At the biological level, through the influence of Arcturian-connected consciousness on the tradition of natural healing and plant medicine that runs parallel to and in conflict with the dominant pharmaceutical medical model, the specific plants and fungi that most effectively support the reactivation of higher consciousness, including those that contain and activate DMT and related compounds, have been preserved and transmitted across the suppression campaigns of the draconian management system. And at the direct contact level, there is consistent testimony of Arcturian beings directly interacting with the DNA of specific humans, making corrections, introducing activations, working at the biological level with the precision of a civilization that has been studying genetics for millions of years longer than human science has existed. The phenomenon of lightworkers, of individuals who are described in the contact literature and in the self-reports of experiencers as having received genetic activations that produced expanded perceptual and healing capacities, is understood in this framework not as metaphor or as psychological phenomenon, but as the literal result of Arcturian or allied genetic intervention in specific human individuals. The individuals who report these experiences, who describe encounters during which they felt their DNA being worked on, who subsequently develop capacities for healing, for empathic perception, for the direct experience of higher dimensional reality, are not all making it up. The consistency of their experiences, the cross-cultural correspondence of what they describe, and the measurable changes in their neurological and behavioral profiles before and after these encounters are data points that deserve serious attention. The draconian genetic interventions in the human lineage were not all of a single type. Some were modifications to the genome itself, insertions and deletions, and rearrangements of sequences designed to produce the suppression effects we have described. But others operated at the epigenetic level, the level at which environmental factors influence which genes are expressed without changing the underlying sequence of the genome. The draconian management system has been extremely sophisticated in its use of epigenetic tools, specifically in its use of trauma as an epigenetic programming mechanism. Research in the field of trauma epigenetics has established, beyond reasonable scientific doubt, that traumatic experience produces heritable changes in gene expression, that the children and grandchildren of trauma survivors carry epigenetic marks that reflect their ancestors' experiences and that affect their own neurological and psychological functioning. The implications of this finding in the context of the control system are staggering. A management system that maintains a population in a chronic state of trauma across multiple generations is not merely producing suffering in the present. It is programming the epigenome, shaping the expression of the genome in future generations in ways that make those generations more susceptible to the same management strategies, more oriented toward fear and survival, less capable of accessing the higher consciousness states that would allow them to see through and transcend the system. This is what the institutionalized violence of human history has been doing to the human species at the biological level. Every generation of war, famine, slavery, persecution, and systematic abuse has been leaving its marks on the human epigenome, marks that accumulate across generations, marks that progressively shape the human population toward the psychological and neurological profile most convenient for the Draconian management system: anxious, reactive, short-sighted, easily manipulated by fear, and chronically unable to access the higher frequency states of consciousness that would allow genuine sovereignty and genuine seeing. The Arcturian work in the area of healing is, in part, a direct counter to this epigenetic programming. The healing frequencies transmitted through Arcturian contact and through the various modalities of energy healing that have developed in human culture under Arcturian and allied influence work specifically to clear the trauma encodings from the human nervous system and epigenome, to restore the natural state of the genome to one in which the higher potential sequences are available for expression rather than suppressed by layers of traumatic imprinting. This is why genuine healing of deep trauma, of the kind that reverses epigenetic programming rather than merely managing symptoms, consistently produces spiritual experiences of expanded consciousness, of contact with a larger reality, of recognition of the self as something more than the traumatized biological organism. The healing is not merely psychological, it is literally a restoration of the biological conditions under which the human genome's highest potential can begin to express. The genetic history of the human species also includes the bloodline hybrids, which we have mentioned in earlier sections. The hybrid bloodlines created by draconian genetic intervention in the human lineage are real biological entities, human beings who carry in their genome modifications that make them more compatible with the draconian frequency range, more susceptible to draconian influence, more resistant to the Arcturian frequencies that work to activate the higher potential of the human genome. These are the bloodlines that the Draconian management system has consistently worked to place in positions of power over human civilization, not because the human individuals bearing these bloodlines are all conscious agents of the Draconian agenda. Many of them have no idea what they carry or what they are serving, but because their modified neurology and endocrine system make them more effective instruments of the control strategy, more naturally oriented toward the hierarchical and domination-focused thinking that the management system requires its human administrators to embody. The research that has been done into the genetics of the ruling families of human history, the dynastic lines that recur in positions of power across cultures and centuries, shows a degree of genetic relatedness that is statistically extraordinary given the time spans and geographic distances involved. The work of researchers who have traced the genetic lineages of modern political leaders and traced their connection to ancient royal bloodlines has been dismissed as conspiracy theory, but the basic genealogical data is not in dispute. The same bloodlines recur in the highest positions of power with a consistency that natural selection and social mobility alone do not explain. Something is managing those bloodlines. Something is ensuring their continued placement in positions of authority. And the genetic evidence suggests that what is being managed is not merely political dynasty, but biological predisposition, the specific modifications that make certain bodies and nervous systems more compatible with the control agenda and more effective as its human face. The information encoded in the human genome is not static. It is responsive to frequency, to environment, to consciousness. The Arcturian transmission of activating frequencies is designed to interact with the human genome in real time, to stimulate the expression of the dormant sequences, to reverse the suppression mechanisms installed by Draconian modification, and to support the emergence of the fully expressed human being. This process is described in the contact literature as already underway, as having been underway for several decades with increasing intensity as the broader cosmic cycle in which the Earth is embedded moves toward a point of energetic shift that will make the activation process both more powerful and more difficult to prevent. We will return to the question of this cosmic cycle and its relationship to the current moment in human history. But first, we need to move through the more recent chapters of the conflict, the chapters in which the Galactic War entered the political and technological history of the modern era, in which the covert contact programs of the mid-20th century brought human governments into direct relationship with both the Draconian presence and the Arcturian and allied presence, and in which the decisions made in those programs, decisions that were made in conditions of extraordinary secrecy and extraordinary pressure, established the framework within which the conflict is playing out in the present day. The secret war, governments, treaties, and the hidden contact. The year 1947 is a watershed in the modern history of the contact between human civilization and the civilizations beyond it, though not for the reason most commonly cited in popular accounts of the UFO phenomenon. The crash near Roswell, New Mexico, in July of that year, and the military recovery of craft and bodies that followed, is the most famous event of that year in the context we are examining, but it was not the beginning of the modern contact. The modern contact had been developing across the preceding decades through encounters that the militaries and intelligence services of the major powers had been logging, studying, and in some cases attempting to intercept since the early years of the 20th century. What Roswell represented was not first contact. It was a catastrophic failure of the secrecy management system that had been built around the contact, a failure that forced the decision-making bodies responsible for that system to confront both the reality of the contact at a level they could no longer plausibly deny to themselves and the necessity of developing a more comprehensive and more sophisticated response to it. The decision that was made in the years immediately following Roswell, the decision to maintain absolute secrecy about the contact while simultaneously conducting the most intensive research and development program in human history to reverse engineer the recovered technology, was not made lightly and was not made by people who were simply corrupt or ignorant. It was made by people who understood, at least in part, what they were dealing with, who recognized the geopolitical implications of the contact, and who made a judgment that public disclosure of the existence of non-human intelligences engaging with the Earth would produce social and political consequences that would make the global situation less stable and less manageable, not more. Whether that judgment was correct, and who ultimately benefited from the secrecy policy they chose, is one of the central questions of the modern phase of this story. The beings recovered at Roswell and at subsequent crash or retrieval sites across the following decades were not representatives of a single civilization. The description of what was recovered at different sites, pieced together from the testimony of insiders across the period of the last several decades, indicates that the craft and bodies recovered at different incidents reflect different technologies and different biological forms, suggesting contact with multiple different non-human civilizations rather than a single extraterrestrial presence. Some of the recovered craft and beings are described in terms consistent with what the contact literature associates with the Greys, a class of beings whose relationship to the Draconian civilization is complex and deserves specific attention. Others are described in terms that suggest the presence of Draconian beings themselves or of their allies. And in at least some accounts, there are retrievals and contacts associated with beings whose description is consistent with the Arcturian and allied presence, beings described as tall, luminous, profoundly peaceful in their energetic quality, and communicating in ways that bypass the language barrier through direct transmission. The Greys are one of the most widely reported and most widely documented elements of the contact phenomenon, and their relationship to both the Arcturian and Draconian civilizations is one of the most important and most misunderstood aspects of the larger picture. The Greys are described as small, large-headed beings with gray or gray-white skin, large black or dark eyes, minimal facial features, and bodies that appear frail by human standards. They are the beings most frequently reported in abduction experiences, the beings that appear most consistently in the contact testimonies of ordinary people across the last several decades. Their presentation in the contact literature is complex and sometimes contradictory. They are described in some accounts as direct Draconian subordinates, or even Draconian-created biological worker units, organic robots in effect created by the Draconian civilization to serve specific functions without the overhead of having full Draconian beings deployed at the level of contact with the human population. In other accounts, they are described as a separate civilization with a distinct history, a civilization that made its own decisions to enter into agreements with the Draconian Empire, agreements that have compromised their sovereignty and that some factions within their civilization are working to reverse. The human government contact with the Draconian-aligned beings, conducted primarily through the Grey intermediaries, produced what is described across multiple independent testimonies as a treaty or series of treaties negotiated in the 1950s and early 1960s between the United States government and representatives of the Grey civilization. The most frequently cited of these agreements is associated with the Eisenhower administration, with accounts describing meetings between President Eisenhower himself and Grey representatives at facilities including Holloman Air Force Base in New Mexico in 1954. The terms of these agreements, as described in the testimony of insiders who claim direct knowledge of their contents, involve the exchange of technology for permission to conduct certain operations on the Earth, specifically the permission to abduct and study human beings, with the condition that abductees would be returned without permanent harm and that the government would be provided with lists of those taken. What the government received in exchange was access to advanced technology, technology based on principles of physics that human science had not yet developed, and that, if successfully back-engineered, would represent a leap in human technological capability of extraordinary magnitude. The temptation of this exchange was apparently irresistible, even in the face of significant moral concerns about the arrangement. What actually transpired in the implementation of these agreements was, by most accounts of those with insider knowledge, significantly different from what had been negotiated. The lists of abductees were not provided, the abductions were not restricted to the terms agreed upon. The human beings taken were not always returned without harm, and the technology transferred was calibrated to be useful enough to be compelling, but not so useful as to allow human civilization to develop genuine independence from the beings providing it. The decision to make this treaty represented, in the framework of the conflict we are examining, a significant victory for the Draconian agenda. It established a formal relationship between the Draconian-aligned civilization and the most powerful human governments, a relationship that bound those governments to secrecy about the contact, that compromised their ability to seek assistance from the Arcturian and allied presence, and that gave the Draconian management system a level of explicit, formal authorization for its activities on Earth that it had not previously had. It also established within the most sensitive corridors of human government a class of officials and contractors who were in regular contact with non-human intelligences of the Draconian-aligned variety, and who, over time, developed relationships of dependency and ideological alignment with those intelligences that shaped their decision-making in ways profoundly contrary to the interests of the human populations they nominally served. The Arcturian and allied response to the treaty was to intensify their own contact with the human population through channels that did not depend on government intermediaries and that the secrecy apparatus could not fully control. The contact literature of the 1950s and 1960s, the period of the so-called Contactee movement, represents one expression of this intensification. Individuals from various walks of life, with no particular government connection and no particular institutional standing, reporting contact with beings who describe themselves as coming from Venus, from Saturn, from the Pleiades, and whose communications were consistently oriented toward warning humanity about the dangers of the path it was on, toward sharing cosmological knowledge that expanded human understanding of the nature of the universe and of the human place within it, and toward encouraging the development of the inner spiritual capacities that were the true protection against the draconian influence. The Contactee movement was systematically discredited by the intelligence and counterintelligence apparatus that had grown up around the government contact programs. The individuals who came forward with experiences and communications that challenged the management narrative were subjected to ridicule, surveillance, harassment, and in some cases, more direct forms of intimidation and harm. The cultural programming that made the UFO and contact subject a matter for ridicule in mainstream culture was deliberately constructed and deliberately maintained because the management of public perception of the contact was one of the most critical elements of the overall control strategy. A public that took seriously the possibility of genuine benevolent contact with civilizations more advanced than their own would inevitably begin asking questions about why their governments had not pursued such contact openly, and those questions would lead in directions that the management apparatus was not willing to allow. The decades following the treaty era produced two parallel developments in the relationship between human civilization and the off-world presences. The first was the development of what researchers call the secret space program, a program built using the technological knowledge derived from the treaty relationship and from the back engineering of recovered craft that went far beyond the public space programs of NASA and the Soviet space agencies, and that involved the establishment of human presences in space, including on the Moon, on Mars, and in various orbital facilities that have never been disclosed to the public. The testimony of individuals who claim direct experience with these programs is extensive, detailed, and consistent in ways that are difficult to explain as fabrication, and the circumstantial evidence that supports the general contours of their claims, while not constituting formal proof, is substantial. The secret space program is described as having had contact with multiple off-world civilizations, including both Draconian-aligned and Federation-aligned presences, and as having navigated the tension between those presences in ways that, depending on the faction within the program, favored one side or the other. The second parallel development was the activation of a new generation of human individuals who were, from the contact literature's perspective, specifically born into this era for the purpose of the work of awakening. These are the individuals described variously in the contact literature as starseeds, as wanderers, as light workers, people who experience from early childhood a profound sense of not belonging to the world they find themselves in, who have persistent memories or dreams that seem to originate from somewhere other than their ordinary life experience, who are drawn irresistibly to questions of consciousness, of spiritual development, of the nature of reality beyond the official story, and who, when they encounter the contact literature and the experiencer testimonies, recognize in them something that resonates with a knowledge they carry at a level deeper than ordinary memory. These individuals are described in the Arcturian communications as beings who have lived in higher dimensional civilizations and who have chosen, for the purposes of this specific phase of the conflict, to incarnate in human bodies in order to carry the frequencies of higher consciousness into the human field and to contribute to the activation process from the inside. The scale of this activation program is described as unprecedented, with estimates of the number of starseed beings currently incarnated in human bodies ranging from tens of millions to hundreds of millions. If this claim is even partially accurate, it represents a deliberate and strategic infusion into the human population of a significant number of beings whose soul-level orientation is toward the Galactic Federation's vision of human development. Beings who, regardless of whether they consciously understand their mission, carry in their energy field a frequency that contributes to the larger activation of human consciousness. The clustering of these individuals in the human population at this specific moment in history is not accidental. From from the Arcturian perspective. It corresponds to the cosmic cycle that makes this era, this specific period in human history, the critical threshold, the moment when the decision about which direction human consciousness will develop is closest to being made, and when the addition of millions of additional voices, energies, and frequencies on the side of awakening can make a decisive difference. The internal politics of the secret programs and of the government and corporate structures that developed around the management of the contact are not monolithic. Just as the Draconian civilization has internal factions with different strategic approaches, the human power structures that developed under Draconian influence contain individuals with different degrees of understanding of what they are serving, different degrees of commitment to the continuation of the management system, and different responses to the increasing impossibility of maintaining the secrecy apparatus as more and more information has leaked into public awareness through the various channels that the management system has not been able to fully control. There are, within the establishment, individuals who understand that the game as it has been played cannot continue indefinitely and who are working in various ways and with various agendas toward a controlled or managed disclosure of some portion of the truth about the contact. Whether their version of disclosure, if it comes, will serve the human interest in genuine sovereignty and genuine understanding, or will serve the Draconian interest in managed revelation that replaces the old control framework with a new one, is one of the critical questions of the current moment. The abduction phenomenon deserves its own careful consideration in this context. The phenomenon, as reported by the individuals who experience it, is extraordinarily complex and resistant to simple characterization as either entirely benevolent or entirely malevolent. The experiences reported include medical procedures of various kinds, the taking of biological material, the witnessing of hybrid children, the receiving of communications about the state of the Earth and the danger of current human trajectories, and, in some experiences, encounters with beings of very different character from the small gray beings, encounters with taller beings of human or near-human appearance, who seem to be present in a more supervisory or protective capacity. The complexity of the abduction phenomenon, when analyzed carefully, reflects the complexity of the off-world landscape. The gray beings may be conducting their own agenda, operating under Draconian direction, while in some cases the contact also involves Arcturian or allied beings who are monitoring the situation, sometimes intervening to limit the extent of what is done. The specific genetic program described by many abductees, the hybrid program in which genetic material is taken from human individuals and used in the creation of hybrid beings who appear to combine human and gray biological characteristics, is one of the most disturbing elements of the contact phenomenon, and its relationship to the larger conflict is one of the most discussed topics in the contact literature. The Draconian-aligned explanation for this program, when it is offered at all, frames it as a preservation effort, as the saving of genetic diversity in preparation for some coming catastrophe. The alternative interpretation offered by researchers and by Arcturian communications frames it differently, as a biological resource extraction program, as an attempt to access and utilize the extraordinary genetic heritage of the human genome without triggering the activations that full embodiment in a human body would produce, as a mechanism for creating a servant class of beings who carry human potential but are constitutionally more compatible with the Draconian frequency range. The shadow government structures that developed around the management of the contact, often described in the research literature under various names including Majestic 12, the special access programs, and the various corporate and military compartments that house what some researchers describe as the breakaway civilization, represent the most fully developed expression of the Draconian management system in the modern era. They are human institutions, staffed by human beings, making human decisions, but they are institutions whose operating philosophy and whose deepest strategic orientation has been shaped by decades of relationship with the Draconian-aligned presences, by the absorption of the service to self philosophy through that relationship, and by the convergence of the Draconian agenda with the pre-existing tendencies of the human power structures they emerged from. The people running these programs are not all aware that they are serving a non-human agenda. Many of them believe they are serving national security or human civilization or their own technological and economic interests, but the aggregate effect of their decisions has been to implement, at the level of global politics and technology, exactly the program that the Draconian management philosophy would specify. The question of what happens next, of how this situation resolves or how it transforms, is where we are now in the early decades of the 21st century, and it is to that question that the remaining sections of this documentary are addressed. The control grid, how the Draconian system manages modern humanity. Understanding the Draconian management system in its modern expression requires stepping back from individual events and looking at the structure as a whole. Conspiracy research, as a field, has done considerable work in identifying specific mechanisms of control: central banking and debt slavery, the pharmaceutical suppression of natural medicine, the management of information through media consolidation, the militarization of government, the revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate, the use of manufactured crisis to justify the expansion of state power, the systematic suppression of free energy technology, and other innovations that would undermine the existing power structure. All of these findings are real. All of them represent genuine insights into specific mechanisms by which human civilization is being managed against the interests of the majority of the human beings living within it. But they are pieces of a puzzle, and the puzzle only becomes visible when you have the picture on the box. The picture on the box is the Draconian management system, a comprehensive, multi-layered, multi-generational system for maintaining a large population of conscious beings in a state of managed limitation that maximizes the energetic harvest available to its designers, while minimizing the risk of the population developing the capacity to recognize and exit the system. The modern management system operates on 4 primary levels. The first level is the material, the physical structures of economy, governance, and technology that organize human life at the gross material level. The second level is the informational, the control of what human beings know, believe, and are able to imagine as possible. The third level is the biological, the direct management of the human organism's neurological and physiological capacity for higher consciousness states through diet, pharmaceutical intervention, environmental contamination, and epigenetic programming. And the fourth level is the spiritual, the management of human religious and philosophical frameworks to prevent the direct experience of the divine that would render all other management systems unnecessary. Each of these levels reinforces the others, and the system's resilience comes from that mutual reinforcement. Attacking any one level, if the others remain intact, produces only temporary or partial results. The material level is the most visible and the most studied. The global financial system, built around debt-based currency creation by private central banks operating under government charters, is a machine specifically designed to concentrate wealth upward and to maintain the majority of the working population in a condition of chronic financial insecurity. Chronic financial insecurity is a state of chronic stress. Chronic stress maintains the human nervous system in sympathetic activation. Sympathetic activation suppresses the parasympathetic states in which the higher functions of human consciousness, creativity, empathy, and spiritual perception are most accessible. The financial system is therefore not merely a political or economic structure. It is a neurological management tool maintaining the mass of the human population in a biological state that most effectively suppresses the consciousness capacities that would allow them to see through and transcend the system. The development of artificial scarcity is another material-level management tool. The Earth produces, by any reasonable calculation, more than enough resources to meet the material needs of every human being alive. The persistence of poverty, hunger, and lack in the midst of extraordinary abundance is not the result of inadequate production. It is the result of deliberate distribution management, the organization of economic systems in ways that ensure a significant portion of the global population remains in a state of material deprivation. This deprivation serves the management agenda directly. People who are focused on physical survival do not have the surplus time, energy, or psychological bandwidth to develop the inner life. to pursue the inquiry, to do the spiritual and intellectual work that would allow them to understand what they are living in. Survival consciousness is not the same as awakened consciousness, and the deliberate maintenance of large portions of the global population in survival mode is one of the most effective frequency management tools available to the system. The informational level of the management system is perhaps the most sophisticated and the most elaborate expression of the Draconian management philosophy in the modern era. The consolidation of global media into a small number of corporate structures controlled by a relatively small network of interlocking ownership relationships has produced a global information environment in which the range of legitimate opinion, the range of facts considered worthy of serious attention, and the range of futures considered worth imagining are all narrowly defined and actively policed. This is not primarily accomplished through censorship in the crude sense, though censorship is certainly a tool in the system. It is accomplished primarily through the more sophisticated mechanisms of what Noam Chomsky, working entirely within the mainstream academic framework, identified as the manufacturing of consent, the construction of a framework of assumptions, a set of acceptable parameters within which all legitimate discussion occurs, such that the deepest structures of the system never need to be defended because they are never seriously challenged. The management of the UFO and contact subject within this informational system is a case study in how the system works. The existence of the contact, and specifically the existence of the Draconian presence and its relationship to human power structures, is the most important piece of information that the management system requires to be kept from the public. The tools used to accomplish this are multiple and layered. The first is the ridicule mechanism, the association, built over decades through targeted media and entertainment content, of the UFO subject with gullibility, with irrationality, with the kind of person who is not a serious thinker and whose views do not merit serious attention. This association functions as a social cost. For most people, taking the contact subject seriously in public carries a reputational risk that is effective as a behavioral deterrent. The second is the limited hangout, the periodic release of carefully curated information about the contact, enough to acknowledge that something real is happening, not enough to reveal the nature of what is actually happening, or the nature of the relationship between the management system and the non-human presences it has been in relationship with. The third is the false flag operation, the deliberate staging of contact-related events designed to generate either false evidence of benign contact or false evidence of hostile contact, depending on what the management agenda requires at a given moment. The media consolidation that enables this informational management did not happen by accident. It happened through a series of regulatory decisions, corporate acquisitions, and financial maneuvers that consistently moved in the direction of concentration, consistently reduced the number of independent voices in the information landscape, and consistently placed the most powerful informational platforms under the control of the interlocking network of ownership that serves the management agenda. The same network that controls the major media properties controls significant portions of the pharmaceutical industry, the defense industry, the financial industry, and the political funding structures that determine which individuals reach positions of governmental power. This is not conspiracy theory. It is corporate organizational chart analysis. The network is real, it is documentable, and its behavior, when analyzed over time, shows a consistent orientation toward the maintenance and extension of the management system. The biological level of management is where the Draconian system shows its most technically sophisticated face in the modern era. The human body is a consciousness processing system. It generates and transmits frequencies of consciousness that reflect its biological state. A body in a state of optimal health, properly nourished, properly rested, free of chemical toxins, with a functioning pineal gland and a nervous system that is capable of both high activation and deep parasympathetic rest, generates frequencies of consciousness that are significantly more coherent, significantly more capable of accessing higher dimensional information, and significantly more resistant to the fear-based management tools that are the Draconian system's primary means of control over the population. A body body that is chronically stressed, poorly nourished, loaded with environmental toxins, with a calcified pineal gland, and a nervous system locked in chronic sympathetic activation, generates the frequencies of consciousness that are most easily managed, most easily directed, and most easily harvested. The global food system has been transformed over the course of the last century into a delivery mechanism for a diet that is extraordinarily effective at producing the second type of body. The shift from whole, living foods grown in mineral-rich soil to processed, chemically preserved, sugar-saturated, seed oil-laden food products is not merely a consequence of industrial efficiency. It is, in the framework of the management system, a deliberate nutritional suppression strategy. The specific substances most aggressively introduced into the food supply, refined sugar, industrial seed oils, artificial additives, and preservatives, glyphosate herbicide residues that disrupt the gut microbiome, which is now understood to be central to neurological function, are precisely the substances most effective at producing chronic inflammation, neurological impairment, hormonal disruption, and metabolic dysfunction. These conditions are profitable for the pharmaceutical industry. They are also effective at maintaining the human population in the biologically suboptimal states that are most convenient for the management system. The pharmaceutical management of human biology is a particularly sophisticated expression of this strategy because it operates under the banner of healing while systematically suppressing the most important forms of biological self-regulation. The most powerful consciousness-modifying substances known to human pharmacology are the naturally occurring compounds found in plants and fungi. The tryptamine compounds, the ergot derivatives, the cannabinoids, the various alkaloids that have been used across human history as tools for accessing higher states of consciousness and for healing conditions that conventional medicine cannot effectively address. These compounds are Schedule I controlled substances in most jurisdictions, the most restrictively regulated category in drug law, the category that includes heroin and is applied to substances deemed to have no medical use and high abuse potential. The designation of these substances as Schedule Y, in the face of their demonstrated safety and their demonstrated efficacy in treating conditions including addiction, depression, and trauma that conventional pharmaceuticals treat poorly or not at all, makes sense only in the context of the management system's need to prevent widespread access to the biological states these substances facilitate. The pharmaceutical system's replacement for these naturally effective consciousness tools is a pharmacopoeia of synthetic compounds that manage symptoms without addressing underlying causes, that create dependency rather than resolution, and that, in the case of the most widely prescribed psychiatric medications, specifically target the neurological systems involved in consciousness regulation in ways that narrow the range of conscious experience rather than expanding it. The antidepressant and antipsychotic medications that are now prescribed to an extraordinary proportion of the population in developed countries produce their effects by modulating the serotonin system, the dopamine system, and other neurotransmitter systems that are the biological infrastructure of the varied states of consciousness available to the human organism. The effect of this modulation at the population level is a flattening of the consciousness landscape, a reduction in the amplitude of the extremes of experience, including both the extremes of suffering and the extremes of spiritual opening and insight that tend to accompany them. The management of human spiritual frameworks, the fourth level of the system, is perhaps the most subtle and the most far-reaching in its effects. The great world religions began, in virtually every case, with the direct spiritual experience of an individual or a small group of individuals who made genuine contact with the larger reality that the Arcturian and allied traditions describe, the experience of the fundamental unity of consciousness, the direct recognition of the divine nature of the self, the dissolution of the fear of death through the direct experience of the continuity of consciousness beyond the physical body. These genuine experiences produced teachings that were revolutionary precisely because they pointed towards the availability of the divine within every individual, teachings that challenged the authority of the institutional religious structures of their time, and that proposed a vision of human spiritual capacity that was incompatible with the management system's requirement that human spiritual life be mediated by controllable institutions. The subsequent history of virtually every major world religion is the history of the management system's response to these genuine spiritual breakthroughs. The institutionalization of the teaching, the replacement of the direct experience with a set of beliefs about the experience, the construction of a hierarchy of interpretation that reestablishes the institution as the mediator between the individual and the divine, the suppression of the mystical traditions within each religion that preserve the possibility of direct experience, and the weaponization of the original teaching against the very human liberation it was initially aimed at producing. The God who in the original experience was the loving ground of all being becomes, in the institutional religion, the punishing authority whose requirements include submission to earthly hierarchies that just happen to reflect the management system's requirements. The heaven that was the direct experience of the fullness of consciousness becomes, in the institutional religion, a reward reserved for the afterlife and contingent on compliance with the institution's behavioral requirements during the current one. The New Age movement, which emerged in the 20th century as a response to the limitations of institutional religion, has also been subject to its own version of management. The genuine insights of the New Age tradition, the recognition of the multi-dimensional nature of reality, the importance of consciousness in shaping experience, the reality of non-human intelligence and non-ordinary states of consciousness have been surrounded and diluted by a vast quantity of content designed to make the subject feel good without providing the actual tools or the actual knowledge that would produce real transformation. The spiritual bypassing that characterizes much of the New Age landscape, the use of spiritual concepts to avoid rather than engage the actual challenges of human development, is not accidental. It is the management system's adaptation to a population that has become too sophisticated to be fully controlled by conventional institutional religion, an adaptation that offers the feeling of spiritual development without the substance of it. The Arcturian communications that have come through the most serious channels in the contact literature are very clear about this. They distinguish carefully between genuine spiritual development, which involves real confrontation with the self, real resolution of trauma, real transformation of the patterns of consciousness that keep the individual embedded in the management system, and the spiritual entertainment that keeps seekers busy and feeling good about their seeking without actually changing anything fundamental about how they live or how they see. The management system has no objection to spiritual entertainment. It has a very strong objection to genuine awakening, which is why the traditions, teachers, and practices that consistently produce genuine transformation are consistently marginalized, suppressed, or co-opted. All four levels of the management system are now under pressure from forces that the system has not been able to fully contain. The internet, for all its own management problems and its use as a surveillance and manipulation tool, has also broken the monopoly on information that was central to the informational management level. The natural health movement and the psychedelic renaissance are challenging the biological management level, reintroducing suppressed knowledge about the human organism's healing capacity and the consciousness tools that access higher states. The global awakening of interest in genuine spiritual development, as distinct from institutional religion and spiritual entertainment, is challenging the spiritual management level, and the economic instability generated by the management system's own excesses, the debt bubble, the wealth concentration, the erosion of the material conditions of life for the majority, is challenging the material management level by making its dysfunctionality increasingly impossible to ignore. The draconian response to this multi-level challenge is the subject of the next section of this documentary, the escalation strategy, the attempt to use the tools of the management system at a level of intensity that was not previously deployed to establish before the awakening process reaches its critical threshold a degree of control over the human population that would be permanent rather than merely continuing. What this escalation looks like, how it maps onto the events of the early 21st century, and what it means for the trajectory of the conflict are questions we will now address directly. The Great Escalation, the final phases of an ancient war. There is a principle that appears consistently across the contact literature and across the Arcturian communications, a principle that is counterintuitive enough that it is worth stating clearly before we proceed. The principle is this: The intensity of the resistance is proportional to the proximity of the breakthrough. When a system that has maintained itself through the suppression of a particular possibility finds that possibility approaching despite its best efforts to prevent it, the response of the system is not to relax its efforts, but to intensify them dramatically. The intensification is not a sign that the system is winning. It is a sign that the system is becoming desperate. It is the behavior of a structure that knows, at some level of its own functioning, that what it has been working to prevent is becoming inevitable, and that is making its last great effort to prevent it before the window closes. This principle explains the escalation of the Draconian management system in the early decades of the 21st century. The events of this period, viewed through the lens of the conflict we have been describing, are not evidence of a system operating from a position of strength. They are evidence of a system operating from a position of increasing alarm, making moves it would not have made if its more measured, more patient long-term management strategy were still sufficient to the situation it faces. The haste, the overreach, the increasingly visible character of the mechanisms that were previously invisible are all signs of a management system that has entered a phase of behavior inconsistent with the patient, multi-generational approach that characterized its most effective periods. The cosmic cycle that is driving this escalation is described across multiple traditions and in the Arcturian communications as a galactic scale energetic event, a shift in the fundamental frequency of the region of the galaxy in which the Earth is located that occurs on a timescale of approximately 26,000 years, and that is associated in various traditions with the completion of one great cycle and the beginning of another. The Mayan long count calendar, which ended on December 21, 2012, was one of the most discussed expressions of this cycle in the public conversation about cosmic timing in the early 21st century. The significance of that date was not that the world ended, as the popular misunderstanding suggested, but that a major transition in the quality of the cosmic energy affecting the Earth began. The Arcturian communications describe this transition as the thinning of the veil, a reduction in the density of the frequency barrier that has separated the physical third-dimensional experience of humanity from the higher dimensional reality in which the larger conflict and the larger support for human awakening are taking place. The thinning of the veil has multiple effects. For those who are oriented toward awakening, toward the development of their higher capacities, toward the integration of the cosmic heritage encoded in their DNA, it represents an acceleration of the activation process. Things that would have taken decades of dedicated spiritual practice to achieve become more accessible. Higher states of consciousness become more available. The contact with the Arcturian and allied presence becomes more direct and more unmistakable. For the Draconian management system, the thinning of the veil represents an existential threat because the management system depends absolutely on the maintenance of the frequency barrier. A population that can perceive the higher dimensional reality directly, that can see the architecture of the control system from outside its frequency range, is a population that cannot be effectively managed by the tools that have worked for millennia. This is why, from the framework we are examining, the early 21st century has been characterized by the simultaneous intensification of both the awakening process and the management system's attempts to prevent that awakening from reaching critical mass. Both dynamics are real, both are intensifying, and the outcome, the question of which dynamic will define the trajectory of the next phase of human history, is genuinely uncertain in the sense that it depends on human choice, on what the human beings in this era decide to do with the situation they find themselves in. The Draconian escalation strategy in the modern era has several key components. The first is the acceleration of technological control, the development of surveillance technology, of artificial intelligence systems capable of monitoring and analyzing the behavior of entire populations, of social credit systems that use the monitoring data to create behavioral incentives for compliance with management norms, and of communication infrastructure that is designed from the ground up to be trackable, filterable, and controllable, represents the construction of what might be called a digital control grid. This grid is presented to the public as a set of consumer conveniences, as safety and security tools, as neutral technological progress. Its actual function, from the management perspective, is to extend the reach of the informational management level to cover every form of human communication, to make invisible communication impossible, to create an environment in which the specific conversations that would most threaten the management system, those about the nature of the control system itself, about the contact, about the possibilities beyond the managed reality, can be identified and suppressed before they reach the threshold of influence that would allow them to catalyze the kind of mass awakening the management system fears. The second component is the acceleration of biological management through new pharmaceutical and genetic technologies. The development of mRNA technology and its deployment in the context of the global pandemic of 2020, the enthusiasm with which it was promoted as the solution to a biological crisis, the extreme pressure applied to ensure its adoption by the maximum possible proportion of the global population, the suppression of discussion about its potential effects on human genetics and biology. All of these elements fit within the framework of a management system seeking to use a biological crisis as the vehicle for the most ambitious biological management intervention since the introduction of fluoride into the water supply. The specific question of whether mRNA technology, introduced into the cells of billions of human beings, can affect the expression of the human genome, including the dormant sequences that the Arcturian activation strategy is working to bring online, is a question that the mainstream scientific establishment has treated as settled, while the actual science of mRNA's interactions with the full genome is far from fully understood. The third component is the ongoing management of the consciousness landscape through the strategic deployment of information and disinformation about the contact itself. The government acknowledgement of UAPs, the unidentified aerial phenomena that began gaining mainstream attention in the late 2010s and accelerated significantly in the 2020s, represents precisely the kind of limited hangout that we described in the previous section. The acknowledgement that the phenomena are real, that they are not attributable to known human technology, and that they represent a genuine national security concern is offered without any of the context that would allow the public to understand what they are actually dealing with. Who are these beings? What is their relationship to human history? What is their relationship to the power structures that have been managing this information for decades? What was agreed to in the 1950s treaties? What programs have been conducted under that agreement? What has been built with the technology derived from it? None of these questions are addressed in the official acknowledgement. What is offered is a carefully calibrated partial truth, enough to establish the government's apparent openness and credibility on the subject, not enough to reveal the actual depth and complexity of the relationship. The purpose of this managed disclosure is multiple. It prepares the public for a more explicit acknowledgement of the non-human presence, a disclosure that a variety of insiders describe as inevitable given the increasing visibility of the phenomena. But it frames that disclosure in terms that serve the management agenda, by leading with the national security framing, by emphasizing the unknowability and potential threat of the phenomena, by placing the conversation firmly within the authority structure of the military and intelligence apparatus. The official disclosure program positions itself to manage the public's understanding of the contact in ways that maintain the fundamental power structure of the management system, even as it acknowledges that something unprecedented is happening. The fourth component of the escalation is the acceleration of what might be called civilizational destabilization, the deliberate intensification of the social, political, and economic disruptions that generate the fear, confusion, and division that are the Draconian management system's most reliable tools. The polarization of political culture in the early 21st century, the intensification of identity-based conflict, the economic precarity generated by the financial systems of the post-2008 era, the anxiety generated by the constant drumbeat of existential threat from multiple directions, climate catastrophe, pandemic, nuclear war, artificial intelligence risk, all of these create the conditions in which the emotional management of the population through fear is most effective, and in which the individual's capacity to develop the inner stability and the higher awareness that would make them less manageable is most compromised. The Arcturian communications speak of this period directly, and they do not minimize its difficulty. They acknowledge that the escalation is real, that the management system's final phase strategy is aggressive and sophisticated, and that the outcome is not predetermined. What they offer, consistently, is a framework for understanding the escalation that prevents the demoralization that the system is designed to produce. The escalation is not evidence that the system is winning. It is evidence that the system is losing and knows it. The very fact that such extreme measures are being deployed, the very desperation of the attempt to establish permanent biological and digital control before the awakening process reaches critical mass, is the clearest possible indication that the threshold is approaching. You do not make your most aggressive move when the situation is comfortable. You make it when you can see that if you don't, the game changes in a way you cannot recover from. The Arcturian response to the escalation has also intensified. The contact communications report a significant increase in the level of direct energetic support being provided to the Earth, a strengthening of the protective grid around the planet. Interventions to limit the most extreme expressions of the escalation strategy that would cross the threshold of acceptable interference with human development, and an intensification of the activation program, the transmission of the specific frequencies that support the expression of the dormant human genetic potential, the phenomenon of spontaneous awakening experiences of individuals with no prior spiritual practice or interest suddenly having profound encounters with higher dimensional reality, is described as becoming more common as the energetic support for awakening intensifies and the veil continues to thin. The relationship between the Galactic Federation and the human population in this escalation period is described as having moved to what the communications call a more direct engagement posture. The constraints of the non-interference principle have not been abandoned, but the interpretation of those constraints has shifted in response to the escalation. When the management system itself is engaged in direct violation of free will through its biological and digital control programs, the strict non-interference reading becomes less applicable because non-interference cannot mean allowing a population's free will to be permanently eliminated while declining to intervene on the grounds of respecting free will. The Federation's lawyers, in the cosmic sense, have argued successfully that the escalation has moved the situation into a category that permits more direct support than was previously authorized. This more direct support includes the dismantling or disruption of specific technologies used in the suppression of human consciousness, interventions in specific crisis situations that would have produced irreversible civilizational damage, and a significant increase in the direct contact with individual human beings through all of the channels the contact has historically used. The escalation has also brought into sharper focus the specific individuals and specific institutions through which the Draconian management system exercises its most direct control over human civilization. The concentration of wealth in the hands of a very small number of individuals, a concentration that accelerated dramatically in the early 21st century, reflects the Draconian management system's move toward a more direct consolidation of control, a reduction in the number of human intermediaries required, and a corresponding reduction in the number of potentially defecting or independently acting elements. A management system operated through a few thousand heavily conditioned individuals at the apex of the global power structure is more controllable than one dispersed across the traditional hierarchies of multiple national elites. The consolidation is a feature of the final phase strategy, not a bug. The entities that sit at the very apex of this consolidated structure, the ultra-wealthy individuals and families, the supranational organizations and think tanks, the global financial institutions that transcend national authority, are not all equally witting participants in the Draconian agenda. Some are, with various degrees of understanding of the actual non-human dimension of what they serve. Others are simply maximally self-interested individuals operating within a system that rewards the behavior the management agenda requires, without any awareness of the non-human context that system was designed within. But the aggregate behavior of the structure, regardless of what any individual within it understands about its ultimate nature, is consistent. The consolidation of power, the suppression of the consciousness tools that threaten power, the generation and maintenance of the conditions that produce the manageable population. The Galactic Council, the body within the Federation structure that has oversight responsibility for the situation on Earth, is described in the Arcturian communications as having made a determination in the current era that the conditions that would allow the full human awakening to proceed must be protected from the final escalation of the management system's attempts to prevent it. This determination and the actions it has authorized are described as unfolding in a time frame measured in years and decades rather than centuries and millennia, which is itself a significant departure from the long arc perspective that characterizes most Federation engagement with developing civilizations. The acceleration of the timeline reflects the urgency of the situation. The window in which the awakening can proceed to the threshold that makes it irreversible is a real window, and the management system's escalation is a real effort to close it before it reaches that threshold. What this means in practical terms for the people alive in this era, for the human beings who are navigating the extraordinary complexity and difficulty of the current moment, is what the final sections of this documentary will address, not as abstract cosmological speculation, but as a specific, practical understanding of what the conflict means for individual human lives and for the collective trajectory of the human species. The human role, sovereignty, awakening, and the cosmic choice. At every point in this story, from the earliest decisions about what to do with the genetic heritage of the Lyron refugees to the cosmic council determinations of the present era, the question of human choice has been present, not as a formality, not as a technicality in the legal framework of galactic law, but as a genuine and fundamental reality. The conflict between the Arcturian and Draconian civilizations has been fought over the Earth, and it has been fought using human institutions, human bodies, and human history as its medium. But the question at the center of the conflict has always been a question that only human beings can answer, and that no other civilization, however powerful, however ancient, however well-intentioned, can answer for them. The question is this: what do you choose to become? This is not a rhetorical question. It is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the actual decision point toward which all of the history we have been examining has been building. The entire architecture of the Draconian management system is designed to ensure that the majority of human beings never consciously face this question, because a human being who faces it consciously, who understands the full context of what is being asked and what the stakes are, is a human being who is capable of making a choice that the management system cannot survive. And the entire arc of the Arcturian engagement with humanity, across all the millennia of whispered influence and direct contact and energetic support, has been aimed at bringing as many human beings as possible to the point where they are capable of facing this question and making the choice consciously. The concept of human sovereignty, in the context we are working with, means something more specific than the political concept of self-governance. It means the recognition, in the full depth of one's being, of what one actually is, a being of cosmic heritage, carrying in the DNA of this physical body the encoded wisdom of billions of years of conscious development across the galaxy. A being whose consciousness is not produced by the brain, but is expressed through it. A consciousness that is not bounded by the duration of a single human life, but is continuous across lifetimes, across dimensions, across the full spectrum of existence, from the densest physical matter to the highest frequencies of what the traditions call spirit. A being whose essential nature is not the fearful, limited, mortal creature that the management system works to maintain in consciousness, but is something far vaster, far more capable, and far more connected to the living intelligence of the universe than the managed reality allows it to know. The recognition of this sovereignty is not merely a psychological or philosophical shift. It is a biological event. When a human being genuinely contacts the truth of what they are, when the recognition occurs not just as a mental understanding, but as a direct experience of the self in its full dimension, the effect on the biology is measurable. The nervous system shifts out of the chronic sympathetic activation that has been its default mode. The endocrine system changes. The brainwave pattern shifts toward the integrated, high-coherent states associated with peak function and with experiences of transcendence. The epigenome changes. Genes that were suppressed by the chronic stress of managed limitation begin to express. The pineal gland, to whatever extent it has not been irreversibly calcified, begins to function more fully. The human being, in short, begins to activate. And the activated human being is a fundamentally different organism from the managed one, different in its biology, different in its consciousness, different in its relationship to the reality that surrounds it. The process of awakening, the process by which a human being moves from the managed state to the sovereign state, is not quick, it is not easy, it is not, as the spiritual entertainment industry would sometimes suggest, primarily a matter of adopting certain beliefs or performing certain practices. It is, first and foremost, a confrontation with the self, with the full reality of one's own consciousness, including all the dimensions of that consciousness that the management system has shaped, all the fear, all the trauma, all the inherited patterns, all the ways in which the service to self philosophy has been absorbed and is being expressed in one's own life, all the ways in which the managed reality has been accepted as ultimate reality. This confrontation is the beginning of genuine awakening, and it is far more uncomfortable than the spiritual entertainment version of the subject prepares most people for. The Arcturian communications are clear about this. They do not describe the awakening process as a pleasant journey from darkness to light in a simple arc. They describe it as a rigorous, sometimes painful, ultimately liberating process of dismantling the structures that have kept the human being in its managed state. A process that involves genuine confrontation with the depths of one's own conditioned consciousness and genuine commitment to the work of transforming what is found there. They describe it as the most important thing a human being can do in this era, and they describe the support available to those who undertake it, both from the Arcturian presence itself and from the cosmic energies of the current transition, as unprecedented in the history of the Earth. The specific practices and methods through which this process unfolds are diverse, and the contact literature is careful not to prescribe a single path, because the diversity of human consciousness requires a corresponding diversity of approaches. What the Arcturian communications consistently emphasize as the foundation, without which no other practice is fully effective, is the direct relationship with one's own consciousness, the development of the capacity for witness, for the observation of one's own mental and emotional processes from a position that is not fully identified with those processes. This is the fundamental skill of meditation, of mindfulness, of what the contemplative traditions of every culture have been pointing toward in their various ways. The capacity to step back from the content of consciousness and recognize the awareness in which that content is arising. This recognition, even in its earliest and most tentative forms, begins to establish within the individual a reference point outside the managed reality, a point from which the management is visible as management rather than as natural and inevitable fact. From this foundation, the other dimensions of the awakening process can proceed. The healing of trauma, which is the biological work of reversing the epigenetic suppression of the higher potential sequences in the genome. The development of discernment, the cultivated ability to distinguish between the frequencies of truth and the frequencies of manipulation, to feel in the body the difference between information that resonates with actual reality and information that has been shaped to produce a specific emotional or behavioral outcome. The expansion of perception, the gradual opening of the sensory and intuitive capacities that the management system has suppressed. The development of the ability to feel the energetic dimensions of one's environment, to sense the quality and intention of the beings and situations one encounters, to access the direct knowing that bypasses the mediated information environment and draws on the connection to the larger field of consciousness that is the human being's birthright. The development of genuine community among awakening humans is one of the most important and most consistently emphasized themes in the Arcturian communications. The management system's tools for preventing mass awakening include, prominently, the isolation of individuals who are beginning to wake up, their separation from others who are having similar experiences, the social and professional costs of coming out as someone who takes the contact seriously and believes that the official reality is a managed construct. The isolation is a management strategy. An isolated awakening individual is far less threatening to the system than a community of awakening individuals who support each other's development, who share information and experience freely, and who collectively generate a field of consciousness that is significantly more powerful than the sum of its individual parts. The field of consciousness generated by a community of individuals who are genuinely oriented toward truth, toward healing, toward the development of their sovereign awareness, is not merely a sociological phenomenon. It is an energetic phenomenon that operates according to the same principles that govern consciousness at every level of the universe. Coherent fields of consciousness amplify the capacity of the individual consciousnesses within them. Groups of human beings in genuine alignment around the frequencies of love, truth, and service to others generate a measurable effect on the larger consciousness field of the Earth. This is what meditation research has documented. Large groups of people meditating in coherent states produce measurable reductions in violence, in stress indicators, in the entropy of the social environment in which they are located. The mechanism is not fully understood by conventional science, but the effect is real enough to be replicated, and it is real enough that the Arcturian communications specifically encourage it as one of the most effective actions available to human beings in the current period. The question of what to do about the Draconian management system in a practical sense is one that the Arcturian communications address with care and nuance. They do not advocate for conventional political opposition, for the confrontation of the power structure through the mechanisms of electoral politics or social protest, though they do not dismiss these approaches either. Their primary emphasis is always on the inside work, on the transformation of individual consciousness, because they understand that the management system is not primarily an external structure, it is an internal one. The most fundamental component of the Draconian control system is not the central banks, not the media consolidation, not the surveillance infrastructure, not even the non-human presence itself. It is the patterns of consciousness inside each human being that make those external structures possible. The fear, the unworthiness, the belief in limitation, the identification with the managed self rather than the sovereign self. These are the things that make the external system operational, and these are the things that each individual human being has the power to change without waiting for any external authority, without needing anyone's permission. This is not political quietism. The inner transformation and the outer engagement are not in opposition. A human being who has developed genuine inner sovereignty, who has dismantled the fear-based patterns that make the management system's tools effective, who has developed the perceptual capacities that allow them to see through the managed information environment, is a significantly more effective agent of positive change in the external world than a human being who is operating primarily from reactive emotional states generated by the management system's content. The inner work is not instead of the outer work. It is the foundation of the outer work that actually produces lasting change rather than simply rearranging the furniture within the existing management framework. The Arcturian vision for the human future, expressed with great consistency and great beauty across decades of contact communications, is not a vision in which humanity is rescued by superior beings from the situation it is in. It is a vision in which humanity rescues itself, drawing on the extraordinary resources that its own nature contains, supported by the community of benevolent intelligences that has been working toward this moment for longer than human memory extends, but ultimately making its own choice, claiming its own sovereignty, and stepping into its own power as a conscious and creative participant in the galactic community of intelligence. This vision includes, specifically, the transformation of human social organization from structures based on domination and exploitation to structures based on cooperation and the mutual support of development. The Arcturian communications point to specific human impulses and human traditions that represent the seed of this transformation: the cooperative impulse, the care economy, the traditions of mutual aid and collective wisdom that have survived within and alongside the management system across all the millennia of its operation. These traditions are not marginal. They are, in many cases, the traditions that have sustained the majority of the human population through the periods of greatest stress and deprivation. They are the traditions most consistently suppressed by the management system because they represent the most direct practical expression of the service to others philosophy that is the Draconian system's deepest threat. The transformation of human technology is also part of the Arcturian vision, and it is a transformation that has been deliberately prevented for as long as the management system has been managing human civilization. The free energy technologies that have been suppressed, the healing technologies based on frequency and consciousness, the communication technologies that operate through consciousness rather than through electromagnetic infrastructure that can be monitored and controlled, the agricultural technologies that restore rather than deplete the living soil. All of these represent the technological expression of the service to others philosophy applied to the practical challenges of human material life. They exist. They have been developed, sometimes to significant levels of functionality, by human inventors and researchers across the last century and beyond, and they have been consistently suppressed, the inventors and researchers discredited or worse, the technologies acquired and buried by the interests that the management system serves. The release of these technologies, when it comes, will not come from the top of the existing power structure. It will come from the bottom, from the individuals and communities who develop the social and energetic context in which these technologies can exist and function, because they are technologies that work best in the context of a consciousness that is aligned with their principles. The free energy device that can power a community without the centralized infrastructure of the existing energy system is also a device whose full potential is only accessible to a community that understands and practices genuine cooperation and genuine care for the common good. The healing technology based on frequency and intention works most effectively in the hands of a healer who has developed the consciousness required to generate the necessary frequencies with the necessary precision and love. The technologies are not separate from the consciousness, they are expressions of it. This is one of the most profound insights that the Arcturian communications offer, and it is an insight that challenges both the technological optimism of the mainstream culture and the technological pessimism of much of the alternative culture. Technology in itself is neutral. It is an amplifier of the consciousness that uses it. The technologies of the management system are not intrinsically evil. They are the technological expression of a service to self philosophy, applied with great sophistication and great power. The technologies of liberation are not intrinsically good. They are the technological expression of a service to others philosophy, applied with genuine intelligence and genuine love. What determines which technologies emerge, which are suppressed, and what effects they produce in the lives of the people who use them is the consciousness in which they are embedded. The human species, in the current moment, is engaged in the most consequential act of collective discernment in its history. It is beginning, partially and imperfectly, and with enormous confusion and resistance, to discern between the technologies that amplify its liberation and the technologies that deepen its management, between the information that supports its awakening and the information that deepens its sleep, between the leaders who serve the vision of human sovereignty and the leaders who serve the management agenda while using the language of liberation, between the spiritual paths that lead to genuine transformation and the spiritual entertainment that provides the feeling of development without the substance. This discernment is hard. It is hard because the management system has invested enormous resources in making the distinction unclear, in blurring the lines between liberation and more sophisticated management, in ensuring that the most credible-seeming spokespeople for human awakening are themselves embedded in the management framework at levels they may not fully understand. The development of the discernment capacity, the cultivation of the inner knowing that can feel the frequency difference between truth and manipulation, between genuine service and disguised control, is therefore not merely a spiritual luxury. It is the most practical survival skill available to a human being in the current era. It is the faculty whose development the Arcturian and allied presence has been working to support through every channel available to it since the beginning of their engagement with this planet, and it is the faculty whose suppression the Draconian management system has been most consistently and most urgently working to achieve. The choice before the human species right now is real. It is not metaphorical. It is not a choice that will be made at some future date. It is being made right now in every decision that each human being makes about what to believe, what to pursue, where to place their attention, how to spend the creative energy of their lives, and what kind of world they are willing to work to create. The aggregate of these individual choices is what will determine the outcome of the conflict we have been describing. The resolution. What comes after the war? Every war has an after. This is what wars tend to obscure while they are being fought. The possibility of an after, of a state of affairs beyond the conflict, of a reality that is not organized around the dynamic of opposition that has defined the era of the war. The human experience of history is so thoroughly saturated with conflict that the idea of a genuinely post-conflict human civilization, a civilization not organized around hierarchy and domination, not managed by entities whose interest lies in the suppression of human potential, not living in the chronic stress of managed scarcity and manufactured fear, has the quality of fantasy to most people who contemplate it. This is not because it is fantasy, it is because the management system has been extraordinarily effective at making the managed reality feel like the only reality, at making the limitations of the current arrangement feel like the permanent limitations of what is possible for the human species. The Arcturian communications and the broader body of contact literature that addresses the question of human futures are notably specific about what they describe as the probable trajectory of the species in the event of a successful navigation of the current threshold. Probable, not certain. The law of free will ensures that no future is predetermined, but the cosmic perspective, the view from the level of galactic development that the Arcturian civilization has access to, includes the pattern of how civilizations have navigated this specific threshold in the past, across the many worlds that have faced similar dynamics, and what the outcome of that navigation has typically looked like when it succeeded. This pattern provides not a prophecy, but a map, not a guarantee, but a description of what becomes available when the management system loses its grip. The first and most immediate consequence of a genuine mass awakening, as described in the Arcturian communications, would not be the technological transformation or the political reorganization that most people imagine when they think about the end of the control system. It would be an experiential transformation, a shift in what it feels like to be a human being, a change in the quality of consciousness with which people move through their daily lives. The chronic low-grade anxiety, the sense of helplessness and isolation, the feeling of being small and inadequate and in danger that characterizes the experience of so much of the human population under the management system, would give way to something the Arcturian communications describe as the natural state of conscious beings in a healthy relationship with themselves and their environment, a quality of basic okayness, of being in the right place, of being connected to something larger than oneself, that is fundamentally supportive and fundamentally oriented toward growth rather than toward exploitation. This quality is not naivety, and it is not the elimination of challenge or difficulty from human life. It is simply the absence of the specific psychic weight that comes from living in a managed reality organized around the generation of fear. From this foundation, the transformations in every domain of human life that the management system has been preventing would begin to unfold naturally, not as the result of top-down programs imposed by any authority, but as the organic expression of a population freed from the constraints that had been keeping its natural impulses toward cooperation, creativity, and care for each other and for the living world in check. The technologies would emerge because the inventors who have always existed would no longer be suppressed. The healing methods would proliferate because the people who have always had the knowledge would no longer be persecuted. The organizational forms, the ways of living and working together that reflect the service to others principle and practice, would develop because the human beings who have always been oriented toward them would no longer be systematically marginalized and undermined. The Arcturian communications are consistent in describing this post-threshold period as one that would unfold over generations rather than years. They do not describe a sudden paradise, a snapshift from the current condition to a fully realized galactic civilization. They describe a gradual but accelerating process of healing, of development, of the recovery of knowledge that was lost, and the development of knowledge that is entirely new, of the building of social and technological and spiritual structures that would progressively more fully express the potential of the human being as it was designed, as it was intended, as it has been working toward across all the difficult millennia of its managed development. This process would not be without difficulty. The healing of the epigenetic damage done by thousands of years of traumatic history would take time and would require the sustained commitment of multiple generations. The dismantling of the social structures built around domination and exploitation, and the building in their place of structures built around cooperation and care, would be contentious, would generate resistance, would involve the working through of enormous amounts of accumulated pain and fear and habitual pattern. But the direction would be clear, in a way that it is not clear now, because the current moment is defined by the uncertainty of whether the threshold will be crossed at all. Once the threshold is crossed, once the critical mass of human consciousness has moved into the sovereign, awakened mode, the directionality of the process becomes self-sustaining. The same way that a chemical reaction, once it reaches the threshold of activation energy, proceeds on its own without needing additional input, the awakening of human consciousness, once it reaches the critical threshold, proceeds under its own momentum. The management system can no longer slow it, let alone reverse it. The draconian influence can no longer maintain its grip on the frequency environment of a population that has learned to generate its own higher frequencies from within. The question of what happens to the draconian civilization itself in this scenario is one of the more philosophically interesting and more spiritually significant aspects of the larger picture. The Arcturian communications do not describe the resolution of the conflict as the destruction or the elimination of the draconian civilization. This is important to understand because it challenges the war narrative in a fundamental way. The service to others philosophy cannot, without self-contradiction, aim at the elimination of beings who hold a different philosophy. The resolution of the conflict is not the victory of one side and the defeat of the other in the conventional military sense. It is something more subtle and more profound. The Arcturian understanding of the draconian civilization sees it not as a permanent and irresolvable embodiment of evil, but as a civilization that made a specific choice at a specific point in its development, a choice that has defined its trajectory and produced consequences of enormous scale and of genuine suffering for the civilizations that have been subject to its expansion. But the choice was made by conscious beings, and conscious beings can, always and at any point, choose differently. The Arcturian hope, which they are careful to distinguish from naive expectation, is that the resolution of the conflict on Earth, the genuine liberation of the human species from the management system, would represent for the draconian civilization an encounter with a limit that would catalyze something like the crisis of the great choosing that the Arcturian civilization itself underwent so long ago. The moment when the service to self path reaches its logical conclusion and reveals, even to those who have most committed themselves to it, that it does not actually produce the outcomes it promises. The service to self philosophy holds that power over others is the highest achievement of conscious life, but the Arcturian understanding, and the understanding that emerges from the deepest human spiritual traditions, holds that genuine power is not power over others, but power with oneself. The capacity to act from the fullness of one's own being in alignment with the deepest truth of one's own nature. The draconian civilization, for all its military and political power, for all the extent of its dominion over other civilizations, has never resolved the fundamental tension within itself that drove the development of the service to self-philosophy in the first place. The fear of vulnerability, the inability to rest in the experience of one's own consciousness without the constant reinforcement of dominance over others, the need for the luch harvest because one has lost touch with the internal source of energy that every conscious being contains. These are not signs of strength. They are signs of a civilization that is, in the deepest sense, afraid of itself. The liberation of the human species from the draconian management system would not just change the situation for humanity, it would change the situation for the draconian civilization by removing the resource that the current phase of its existence depends on, and by confronting it with the question of what comes next. What comes next, in the Arcturian vision, would be the draconian civilization's own crisis, its own threshold, its own confrontation with the limits of the philosophy it has built itself around. This would be a genuine crisis, not a comfortable one. But every genuine crisis is also a genuine opportunity. The Arcturian communications express something that can only be described as compassion for the draconian civilization, even in the context of describing the harm it has done and continues to do, not approval. not indifference, but the specific kind of compassion that is capable of holding the being responsible for its choices, while simultaneously recognizing the being's own entrapment in those choices and its own capacity for something different. This is the cosmological context in which the phrase, "the war that shaped humanity," has its deepest meaning. The war did not merely shape humanity by subjecting it to the management of an alien civilization. It shaped humanity by being the crucible in which the full range of conscious possibility was compressed and confronted in a single species, in a single world, in an era of cosmic significance. The human being, as it has developed through the conditions of this managed and contested existence, is a being of extraordinary depth and extraordinary resilience. The suffering that the management system has produced has also, paradoxically, produced in the human species a range of emotional and spiritual capacity that species developing in more comfortable circumstances have not developed. The capacity for compassion in the face of suffering, for love in conditions of fear, for wisdom born of genuine confrontation with the darkest aspects of conscious experience. These are capacities that no other civilization in the galaxy has developed in quite the same way or to quite the same degree, because no other civilization has faced exactly the combination of cosmic heritage and managed suppression that has characterized the human situation. The Arcturian communications speak of this with something that can only be called awe. They have been present throughout human history. They have watched the management system at work, watched the suffering it produces, watched the resets and the suppressions and the repeated cycles of limitation and loss. And they have also watched what the human spirit has done in the face of all of that. The moments of extraordinary art and music and literature produced in conditions of oppression. The mystical breakthroughs achieved by individuals who fought their way through layers of managed reality to direct contact with the divine, using practices and tools that were systematically degraded and persecuted. The revolutionary movements that challenged the control system at the cost of everything, not because the individuals involved had any assurance that they would succeed, but because something in them recognized the rightness of the direction and refused to be talked out of it. The ordinary acts of love and care and generosity that have sustained human communities through the worst of what the management system has produced. These things matter, not just in the local sense as beautiful exceptions to a predominantly grim historical record. They matter cosmically because they demonstrate that the human species has not been broken by what it has been put through, that the potential encoded in the genome has not been permanently suppressed, that it keeps finding ways to express itself despite everything arranged to prevent it, that the fundamental nature of the human being is more resilient than the management system has found it possible to fully overcome. This resilience is the argument made by human history itself for the outcome that the Arcturian vision describes. Not a naive argument, not an argument based on optimism or on the refusal to look at the evidence of how powerful the management system is and how thoroughly it has shaped the human situation. An argument based on the recognition that the most powerful force operating in this situation is not the management system at all. It is the consciousness of the human being itself, which has survived everything and is still, in this era, waking up. The concept of disclosure, as it is discussed in the contact research community, tends to focus on the question of government disclosure of the existence of extraterrestrial intelligence. This is a legitimate and important question, but the deeper disclosure, the one that matters most, is not the disclosure of the existence of non-human intelligence. It is the disclosure of the existence of the human being itself in its full nature to itself. This is the disclosure that the Arcturian engagement with humanity has always been working toward, the moment when the human species, having been shown enough of the true picture to orient itself, chooses to pursue the full truth of its own nature and claims the sovereignty that has always been its birthright, but that has been kept from its conscious grasp by the management system that has been running the show. This disclosure is not going to come from any government. It is not going to come from any institution. It is not going to come from any single charismatic teacher or leader or messenger, though such beings play important roles in the larger process. It is going to come, as it has always come throughout human history, from individual human beings who reach the threshold of their own inner development and cross it, who discover discover on the other side of that threshold a reality so much larger and more beautiful and more real than the managed version they had been living in, that they cannot help but communicate it in whatever form they have available to them to every other human being within reach. It is going to come from the accumulated effect of all these individual crossings, building toward the critical mass that tips the balance of the collective consciousness from the managed mode to the sovereign mode. It is coming now. This is not a statement of certainty, it is a statement of trajectory. The trajectory is visible in the data, the number of people globally who report genuine spiritual experiences that do not fit within the managed religious frameworks. The number of individuals who have encountered in their own interior life the direct experience of a consciousness larger than the personal self. The number of people who have had contact experiences and who, despite the enormous social and professional costs of acknowledging those experiences, have refused to deny what they know happened to them. The number of communities forming around the shared pursuit of genuine development rather than managed spiritual entertainment. The number of scientists who are willing to look at the evidence that the conventional model of consciousness, of biology, of history does not account for, and who are willing to follow that evidence wherever it leads, even into territory their institutions have not sanctioned. The Draconian management system can count these numbers too, and the counting of these numbers is part of what is driving the escalation. The system is in a race. It knows, at whatever level of strategic awareness it operates at, that the direction of the current is running against it, that the energies of the cosmic cycle are amplifying what it has always worked to suppress, and that the window in which a sufficiently comprehensive control apparatus could be established to arrest the awakening process is not indefinitely open. This race is real. The outcome is not determined, and the determining factor is not the technological capability of either side, not the galactic political maneuvering of the Federation versus the Empire, not the interventions of the Arcturian presence or the escalations of the Draconian management system. The determining factor is the choice of the human being, made individually, made collectively, made in the small daily decisions about where to direct attention and how to spend life and what to believe and what to refuse to believe, and made in the larger decisions about what kind of world is worth fighting for and what kind of human being is worth working to become. The Arcturian communications conclude almost always with what might be called an encouragement, and it is an encouragement worth sitting with. They say with great consistency that the human species is not alone in this, that the support available to those who choose the path of awakening from the Arcturian presence and from the many other civilizations that are watching this threshold with something like held breath is real and is substantial, and that it will meet whatever genuine movement the human being makes toward it. They say that the difficulty of the current moment is real, but is proportionate to the significance of what is being decided, and that the beings who are living through this moment, who are experiencing the intensity of the escalation and the beauty of the awakening simultaneously, have chosen to be here at this time because at the soul level they understand what is at stake and they wanted to be present for it. They say that the human being is loved, genuinely and profoundly loved, by the intelligences that have been present with this world throughout its long and difficult story, and that love is not a sentimental or passive force. It is the most active and the most powerful force in the universe, and it has been at work in the situation on Earth for longer than human memory extends, and it is at work now, and it will not stop. The war that shaped humanity is, in this reading, not merely a war about humanity. It is a war that humanity is being shaped by in order to be capable of ending, not through the military defeat of the Draconian civilization, not through the intervention of the Galactic Federation, but through the one resolution that the Arcturian understanding describes as genuine and permanent. The emergence of a human species that has genuinely claimed its own sovereignty, that has genuinely healed the wounds of its managed history, that has genuinely developed the consciousness capacities encoded in its own DNA, and that stands ready as an equal and a genuine partner to take its place in the galactic community of intelligence that has been waiting for it with love and with patience since before the first human eyes opened on this beautiful and embattled world. This is the story, not a comfortable story, not a simple story. Not a story with a guaranteed happy ending, because no genuine story has a guaranteed ending of any kind, but a story with genuine stakes, genuine beauty, genuine tragedy, and a genuine possibility of resolution that would change not just the human situation, but the galactic one. A story in which every person alive right now has a part to play, a role that no one else can play, a contribution that only they can make. A story that is not over, and whose ending depends on what you do next. The answer, if there is one, begins with exactly the question you are asking right now. What is actually going on? Because the first step of every liberation is the willingness to see clearly, and you have begun. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. I love hearing from you. Check out more videos on the screen, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.